Crocodilians are one of the most recognizable animals on our planet. From alligators to salties and even odd creatures like the gharial, there are so many of these amazing animals. This is one of the most successful families of animals to have ever lived, with their most ancient ancestors appearing in the clade known as pseudosuchia. The pseudosuchia first appeared in the Oceanic, the earliest part of the Triassic, about 250 million years ago. Many of these early forms dominated most of the Triassic before dinosaurs began to take over in the Jurassic. Pseudosuchia, and subsequently Crocs as a whole, are part of the group known as archosaurs. Archosauria is an ancient lineage of reptiles, splitting off from other reptiles even prior to the Triassic. They are so ancient that much of their origins are still shrouded in mystery. While a majority of the archosaurs would form the group known as Ava metatarsilia, which included the dinosaurs, birds, and pterosaurs, the pseudosuchians began to diverge and evolve all on their own, creating many unique groups along their journey. It is important to note that the exact origins of this group is still poorly understood overall. One major reason for that is the fossils. We have many Triassic examples of pseudosuchians, but many of their origins seems to point towards an evolution before or very early in the Triassic. Many different groups of them had already begun to take shape, representing multiple clades by the time the earliest members begin to appear in the fossil record. This has caused numerous debates about the exact history of these animals and debates over the exact placement of their lineage. With that in mind, there may be mistakes across this video, as these animals' relationships are still not fully understood, and many studies contradict one another. A lot of information will be subject to change as we learn more about these animals. Many people will say crocodilians haven't changed in millions of years, and they're kind of right, but they have a massive history of change to lead to the swamp puppies we know today. One group, known as the Phytosaurs, has had some debate about it over the years. They have long been considered the most basal pseudosuchians and some of the earliest examples of the group overall. However, at one point this was contested because some scientists believe that Phytosaurs were in fact the sister group to archosaurs and weren't pseudosuchians at all. A 2011 study argued that they had evolved alongside the other archosaurs, and they believed that that could distinguish them from other crocs as a whole based on 10 distinct traits found in archosaurs that were not found in Phytosaurs. However, another study in 2016 reanalyzed the original findings and revealed that several of these traits were lacking variably through many archosaur taxa, including other pseudosuchians, and some were in fact present on some Phytosaurs. Thus, it was updated once again, showing us that Phytosaurs do in fact fall into pseudosuchians, though as the most basal forms, rearranging much of the family as a whole. Phytosaurs take on many forms, with 3 distinct body plans. Most Phytosaurs have rather large heads, which can also distinguish them from other pseudosuchians, but they can still be classified in 3 ways. The first of these are known as the dolichorostral, which are the long-snouted forms. These animals would have occupied a mainly piscivorous niche, using their long jaws to help them snap up prey. The dolichorostral Phytosaurs are homodonts, meaning they only have a single type of tooth, which are conical, just like modern crocodilians. These cone-shaped teeth would be perfect for snatching up aquatic prey. Examples of these animals are animals like Rauisuchians, which is found in relative abundance in the eastern United States. As opposed to them, you have the brachyrostral Phytosaurs. These animals, instead of long and thin snouts, had literally the exact opposites. Their snouts were much shorter, but far broader, like modern alligatorids. Instead of fish, they occupied the opposite niche, being more in favor of hunting prey close to the water's edge, a traditional crocodilian approach. These animals could tackle far larger prey, and because of that, many of them are larger than the other Phytosaurs. One example of this, Smilosuchus, was estimated to be anywhere from 23 to 40 feet in length, or about 7 to 12 meters. Even using a more median number, that still makes them one of the largest predators of that time. As opposed to the homodont teeth, these predators had heterodont teeth, meaning they had multiple types. Their front teeth were tusk-like, meant to impale and hold on to prey. Their rear teeth were more blade-like and would have been used to slice and tear carcasses apart. Very active and efficient predators. The third and final type of Phytosaur are known as altirostral Phytosaurs, and they fall somewhere in between. These animals had broader snouts than animals like Rauisuchians, but longer and weaker snouts than animals like Smilosuchus. These includes animals like Redondosaurus, which had a relatively long head with a broad rear skull, similar to modern crocodilians. Thus, they fall in between and were sort of a generalist feeder, like many crocs today. But these Phytosaurs have some pretty big distinctions from the crocs we know and love today. Phytosaurs are a confusing group to some folks, as they look almost identical to modern crocs when you see some of their images, but they have several features that set them apart. First and foremost, their armor. Indeed, they do have osteoderm armor like modern crocodilians, but they were overall much more heavily armored. Their scutes are heavier than most and provide excellent protection. On top of that, they have something known as gastralia, which are known as abdominal ribs. Much like a Tyrannosaurus, these gastralia would provide better structure to the animal, as well as providing additional protection to their underside. Their ankles are also far more primitive than modern crocs, giving them a limited range of motion, but they have one clever adaptation that I think is excellent. Their nose, instead of being located on their snout, is located on the top of their head, usually above the eyes. This would allow them to submerge all but the top of their head, which may have been necessary for them as they may not have been adapted to holding their breath like crocs today. Modern crocs use a bony palate in the back of their mouth to allow them to open their jaws underwater without intaking said water. While it is assumed that many extinct crocodylomorphs used a fleshy or bony palate, we cannot be certain this extended all the way back to Phytosaurs. This would have made them worse at holding their breath, in stark contrast to modern variations. But Phytosaurs are a mysterious group, and even today their origins are murky and cloudy at best. Many species we have discovered were all well adapted to their aquatic lifestyle already, and a few of the earliest forms have been found, but that leaves large gaps in the history of these animals. Phytosaurs, however, could just not adapt fast enough to the changes. Though they are abundant during the Triassic, it seems that they may have perished completely before the end of it, though there have been rumored Phytosaur fossils in the early Jurassic sediment as well. But other basal pseudosuchians were here as well. A relatively poorly known group, the ornithosuchids, were also present, and while we do have a relatively good idea about their general body plan, only a few taxons have been discovered. These animals have an interesting skull, with the front having a gap between the teeth known as a diastema. This gap was purposeful, and they had two larger lower teeth that would fit into this gap from the bottom jaw. They were similar to some of their other relatives in that they were land-based animals as well, usually moving around on 4 legs. However, they had the ability to move on 2. These are known as facultative bipeds, and they are like chimpanzees, able to walk on just 2 legs for a short period of time. Despite the lack of fossil material, the material we do have is known from several different countries, being Brazil, the UK, and Argentina, which suggests that they were relatively successful animals and were widespread. One of the most notable and complete of these animals is rauisuchians from Argentina. It would have been a predator, around 6.5 feet or 2 meters in length. The ornithosuchids would have been land-based, and hopefully more fossil material is revealed to help us learn more about them. But Phytosaurs and ornithosuchids weren't the only group to dominate during the Triassic. The Triassic was a true age of reptiles, and they diversified heavily during this time as well. Separate from the Phytosaurs and ornithosuchids, a new group of animals known as the Suchia had begun to diversify. These were more derived than the Phytosaurs, and they split into multiple different groups. In the late Triassic, one of the most prominent among these were the aetosaurs. This group takes almost everything you think you know about crocs and turns it on its head. Instead of a mainly aquatic lifestyle, many of these animals were strictly terrestrial. They were almost like the crocodile equivalent of ankylosaurids. They were pretty large and heavily armored. Their osteoderms were thick, interlocking plates, and many were even armored on their undersides, with one major exception, which was an animal called Damastosuchus. This was an adaptation for predators, of course. Also, instead of being predators themselves, many aetosaurs were omnivores or herbivores. Their teeth have shown this, being very similar to other animal groups who have ventured away from reliance on meat. Many aetosaurs have a very pig-like, shovel-shaped snout. They also have adaptations that would enable them to dig more effectively, like large claws. This would allow them to find food among the roots and dirt, another indicator that they were herbivores. Though it is worth noting, some teeth are much more like those of carnivores, and may imply that some aetosaurs were omnivores, or perhaps they were carnivores, though the latter is far less likely based on the rest of their body plan. They were incredibly diverse animals, and today more than 20 different taxons are known. Unfortunately, like many of the other Suchians, they're a bit shrouded in mystery when it comes to their origins. Like the Phytosaurs, the aetosaurs we have found are overall highly adapted and specialized animals, already fairly well along in their evolution. We aren't positive how they came about, nor what most of their ancestors would have been like. What we do know about aetosaurs is that there were multiple types. Some early examples, such as Atoposaurids, doesn't fall into a specific group and is instead separated from the rest. They were relatively simple animals, sharing the overall body plan of their family. From here, a group of aetosaurs known as the Stagnolepididae split into 2 distinct groups, the aetosaurines and the Damastosuchids. The Damastosuchids were defined by having less complex armor overall, but more generalized animals. They more commonly had large spines and spikes, as well as grooved osteoderms, and many of them also had the shovel-like nose I mentioned earlier. The aetosaurines were classified by having lighter skulls overall, with many of the major differences lying in their skull shape. Many of them often also had more specialized armor, femur, although it was often less spiky and protruding as the Damastosuchia. Aetosaurs were one of the dominant life forms during their time in the late Triassic, but they shared their success with many of their relatives. Much like the dinosaurs later on, these primitive archosaurs were battling for survival and dominance, and the pseudosuchia tried many different routes at this time with varying levels of success. And the aetosaurs just so happened to be one of their most successful gambles, for a time. Separate from the aetosaurs, but still not among the later groups, two taxons stand out. This would be Gracillosuchus and Terphanosuchus. Gracillosuchus has actually been the subject of quite the debate from its discovery up until now. When it was originally discovered by Alfred Romer, he believed it to be one of the aforementioned ornithosuchids and the smallest and possibly most basal member of the group. However, in subsequent years, debates arose around its placement, and it was eventually removed from the ornithosuchids as it was found to have unusual traits in its skull and vertebrae, as well as in its osteoderms that differed it from the ornithosuchids. This eventually led to further discussion about where it would be placed. Several suggestions were had over the years, and eventually a 2011 study showed that it was closely related to the aetosaurs and the revueltosaurs, but the debate wasn't over here. In 2014, another study suggested that Terphanosuchus, Gracillosuchus, and another animal known as Yonghaesuchus were all part of a new group known as the Gracillosuchids. Their placement was the same, closely related to the aetosaurs, but now as a monophyletic group rather than a separate taxon. These Gracillosuchids were tiny animals compared to most of their relatives. Gracillosuchus itself is estimated to be no more than 11 inches or 28 centimeters in length. They had 2 rows of osteoderms running down their back, and they were once considered to be faculative bipeds like the ornithosuchids, but more recent interpretations seem to have them restrained to all 4 limbs. This family is, once again, poorly known outside of these 3 taxons, but they're still brilliant. From here, another line of the Suchia would be created, which would survive the Triassic, the Crocodylomorpha. But these guys are still confusing, especially to many who have a hard time keeping track, so I'll do my best to help you guys get a better understanding of their arrangement and what would eventually lead to modern crocs as we know them. Some of the most basal of these animals are the Poposauroidea. They were advanced on terms of early archosaurs and were what most of you probably imagine when thinking of Triassic predators, but there is more than meets the eyes with these archosaurs, as some of them are also herbivores. They may have also been the most widespread and successful of the pseudosuchians at the time, with some taxons like Xylosuchus found in the early Triassic and animals like Ephygia near the end. These animals can be distinguished by a specialized hip and snout structure, which has often gotten them confused for dinosaurs over the years. This is another example of convergent evolution, showing how multiple groups of archosaurs evolved similar adaptations despite having evolved so far apart from one another. Another distinguishing feature about the poposauroids is their lack of osteoderms, except for one specific animal named Chianosuchus. Poposauroids had quite a diversity to them as well, and Chianosuchus was one of the most basal of these examples. It is an unusual animal, reaching up to about 3 meters or 10 feet in length. It had extremely small osteoderms lining its body and had a specialized tail that had tall neural spines. This was most likely an adaptation for a semi-aquatic lifestyle, similar to what other marine reptiles would employ in the future. They appeared to have relatively long limbs as well, allowing them to live on land as well as the sea. They are sort of like modern marine iguanas, but predatory. Several other groups began to diversify during this time, including the fairly basal Stenosauricidae. They were some of the other very early archosaurs and were some of the first to get a near global distribution. They were robust quadrupeds, and they also possessed a sail-like structure, which is once again an example of convergent evolution. This sail resembles that of animals like Dimetrodon, Spinosaurus, and Edaphosaurus, with tall neural spines creating it. Examples of these, like the Xylosuchus and Arizonosaurus, were relatively large animals, between 3 to 4 meters or about 10 to 13 feet in length. They were suggested to be rather active hunters due to their large and powerful legs. Xylosuchus is also one of the oldest archosaurs known, having been found in the early Triassic sediment, suggesting it's about 247 million years old. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier, how the origins of these animals are still kind of misunderstood. With poposauroids appearing so early in the Triassic meant that they had already split off from the rest of the pseudosuchians, and it means that they had begun this immense diversification even prior to what we have in the fossil record. Most of the animals we've talked about so far, from the Phytosaurs to the aetosaurs, are far younger than Xylosuchus, but still basal and primitive in comparison to the poposauroids poposauroids as a whole. It's absolutely fascinating how much we do know about these animals already, yet how much more is still to be discovered. And it also might mean that the earliest pseudosuchians may have appeared even before the Triassic, which is absolutely brilliant. Anyways, the next animal we're going to talk about is the namesake for this group, Poposaurus itself, because we can't talk about this group without mentioning the namesake. This was an unusual animal, reaching around 13 to 16 feet or about 4 to 5 meters in length. Their rear legs are placed closer together, like a dinosaur, and are twice as long as their front limbs. This gives them an extremely dinosaur-like appearance and makes them obligate bipeds like many theropod dinosaurs. Again, this is an example of convergent evolution, and these types of shared traits are not too uncommon in these early archosaurs. They likely adopted this stance to become faster, giving them a larger chance to catch their ever-evolving prey sources. The way they are structured has often led people to confuse them for dinosaurs, and I can't say I blame them based on appearance alone. It wasn't until 1977 that they were recognized not as dinosaurs, but as a new type of pseudosuchian. A few other poposauroids also stand out, including the unusual Lotosaurus. Like the stomatosuchids, they had tall neural spines, giving them a sort of sail on their back, so we think. However, they were far more bulky and were in fact herbivores. Lotosaurus had a beak, not unlike the later ornithischian dinosaurs would. They weren't huge, around 1.5 to 2.5 meters, or about 5 to 8 feet, but they were rotund animals and were likely relatively slow-moving herbivores. The last of the poposauroids that we're going to talk about is a group known as the Phytosaurids. Once again, these animals heavily resembled early dinosaurs and even have a beak superficially resembling the much later ornithomimids. Like them, they were relatively small, beaked, toothless, and light animals, and were expected to be omnivorous in some way. As you can see, the poposauroids were an extremely diverse group and experimented with a lot of different body plans during the Triassic. I suppose when you have a lot of time on your hands, you can try a lot of things, and that's certainly what these guys did. That is one reason crocs are so successful today. They have a strategy that has consistently worked for eons, tweaking it ever so slightly to adapt to new environments, and it took a lot of trial and error to achieve their modern body plan. This brings us further down the line of paracrocodylomorphs to the Loricata, which encompasses all crocodylomorphs and their sister taxon, the Rauisuchia. However, a few taxons don't fall within either family and instead evolved independently within the Loricata, though it does appear that they are closely related to the Rauisuchians. Most of these animals have an upright stance, allowing them a wider range of locomotion. One of these animals, found in Argentina, is Saurosuchus. They were large, quadrupedal predators reaching up to 5.5 meters or 18 feet in length, making them one of the largest of the Rauisuchian lineage. They were extremely dominant predators, though it was revealed in 2023 that they had a relatively weak bite. This was largely on account of the niche they fell into. As the dominant animals of the time, we believe that their teeth had to be just strong enough to tear into a kill that they made to get at the softer meat and organs. They could then leave the rest of the carcass for scavengers after they eat their fill. They were some of the dinosaurs' first bullies, as they shared territory with primitive dinosaurs like Herrerasaurus. Like Saurosuchus, two others, Batrachotomus and Protosuchids, were also large and heavily built predators. Batrachotomus, like Poposaurus, had shortened front limbs, though not to the same extremes as Poposaurus. This indicates it may have been able to spend some of its time on its hind limbs, however it likely spent most of its life on forelimbs, as it was far more heavily built than Poposaurus. Batrachotomus also has a specialized set of osteoderms running down its spine, giving them an almost spike-like ridge of armor. Protosuchids, however, was strictly quadrupedal and seemed to be more robustly built overall than Batrachotomus. Both animals were large and heavy predators reaching upwards of 6 meters or 20 feet in length, and Protosuchids may have reached even larger. They were powerful predators and would have dominated their respective ecosystem, but there was another that was even larger. This is Phytosaur, one of the last of these Rauisuchian line archosaurs. Estimated to reach up to 10 meters, around 33 feet in length, they were among the largest of their lineage and one of the largest predators in the Triassic. They appeared near the end of the era and is one of the last known of their group before the extinction event. Due to the fragmentary nature of their remains, not much is known outside of it being a powerful and large predator, outsizing many of the large predatory dinosaurs. We do know they have a row of osteoderms as well, similar to Saurosuchus, but not quite as extreme. Now we get into the actual line of true rauisuchians. I know it's confusing, but while the other aforementioned creatures are technically part of the rauisuchian line, they are not true rauisuchians themselves and evolved independently from this group despite sharing a more recent common ancestor. The true rauisuchids contain some of the most famous members of these early crocodile relatives, including the infamous Protosuchids. Some of these predators, like the namesake for the group Rauisuchus itself, are restricted to a quadrupedal lifestyle and are more primitive than some of their later relatives. Rauisuchus itself appeared in the early parts of the late Triassic, the Carnian, around 235 million years ago, and soon its family became widespread like many of the other pseudosuchian archosaurs. With species appearing everywhere from Asia to America, they achieved a near global distribution on land and were some of the most successful predators around. Protosuchus is a more advanced form of Rauisuchian and is a large and powerful predator that we all know and love from the late Triassic. As I mentioned, they're pretty big and they can get upwards of 6 meters, around 20 feet in length, and for the longest time the dinosaurs were in their shadow as they and their family dominated the landscape. Like many members of this group, they were covered in osteoderms as protective armor, most likely to protect from other members of their own species or their relatives, as pseudosuchians were the dominant predator in almost every environment at the time. Like some of the other creatures previously mentioned, the poposauroids and ornithosuchids, these animals had reduced front limbs, allowing them to walk on 2 limbs for a short period of time. Interestingly, this has led to a series of debates that show us while not obligated to walk on 2 limbs, Protosuchids more than likely did most of the time and only supported their weight on front limbs during slower movement and while they were younger, as their rear limbs grew longer as they aged. Despite sharing much of their territory and even many of their traits with other archosaurs, few achieved dominance in the late Triassic like the Rauisuchians. Their large eyes, powerful heads, and fully erect stance made them dangerous and incredibly powerful predators. No herbivore was safe, and even their own relatives would have to fear their strength. But despite all that, these animals did not make it past the Triassic, opening the world to the rule of the dinosaurs. Only one group of pseudosuchians managed to keep their hold on the world as we transitioned into this new age, and that was the crocodylomorpha. Before we talk about them, however, let's talk a bit about the Rauisuchia and poposauroids. Historically, these groups have been debated over their true placement due to the similarities between both of them. Some argue that they should be separated as they currently are, while others believe that they may all represent one large group known as the Rauisuchia. However, the recent diversification of animals classified under the poposauroids has led to them being split, as differences can be distinguished between the two groups. Because of the initial vagueness in the description of Rauisuchia, some have even considered it a wastebasket taxon, though now it is considered likely to be paraphyletic, meaning a number of different groups that are related to one another but evolved independently. This has led to a whole nother debate as to whether poposauroids should be included in this at all. Most studies still refer to the poposauroids as a group having evolved separately from the traditional Rauisuchians, being almost like a sister group to the Loricata. It's a lengthy debate and there is still no clear answer, again due to the lack of ancestral material for many of these groups and how they eventually led to the group we know as crocodylomorphs. It is thought that these early crocs evolved from a common ancestor that they may have shared with the Rauisuchians. Some of the earliest and most primitive of these early crocodylomorphs are the sphenosuchians. These are small, lightly built, and show us once again that size and power isn't everything when it came to survival for the crocodilians. Some of these little creatures, like Latargosuchus and Hesperosuchus, were found as far back as the early Triassic, and they've led us to believe that they are ancestral to the crocodiliforms. Many of these little critters were around in the late Triassic as well, and they lasted into the middle of the Jurassic as far as we can tell. As I mentioned, they aren't very large, with most animals like Hesperosuchus reaching around 1.5 meters or 5 feet in length. Despite having evolved a fully terrestrial lifestyle, these animals still tended to stay around water sources, which may have eventually led them back to the water to take advantage of an open niche left by the disappearance of the Phytosaurs at the end of the Triassic. They had evolved long and slender limbs, suggesting that they were relatively fast animals, and their small size would have made it easier to survive where others could not. And so, these tiny animals survived into the Jurassic, some of the first of their family to rise after their spectacular fall in the Triassic. Now we're getting into some of the more advanced animals, the crocodylomorphs, some of which still appeared around the end of the Triassic. This represented 2 major groups, the Protosuchia and the Metasuchia. The Protosuchids are also a group that has been up to much debate to the surprise of no one. As our understanding of these animals grew, we understood that their relationships to each other were not so black and white, and many of the animals once considered Protosuchids had to be reclassified in a way. They are not a true clade of animals, but rather represent a group that holds many similarities to one another. This led eventually to an actual new clade, the Meso-eucrocodilians. This divided the Protosuchians Phytosuchians in two, one group within and one group outside of this new clade. Like the Phytosuchians, they were smaller terrestrial animals, usually no more than a meter long. Many of these animals, like the namesake Protosuchus, were named such because they all resembled true crocodilians despite not actually being them. The Protosuchians were abundant, with those outside of the Mesoeucrocodilia having been around in the Triassic and the early Jurassic, and those within being around in the late Jurassic into the Cretaceous. Because the relationships between these animals is still poorly understood outside of these age-based groups, it is hard to distinguish and classify them into new clades. However, as our understanding deepens, hopefully we can better configure and understand their relationships to one another. The next group, Metasuchia, is just as complicated despite being far better understood. They had further diversified into three major groups, the Notosuchia, Neosuchia, and the Parasauridae. However, more recent studies like the one in 2021 showed that Parasaurids and their line could be classified under Notosuchia, which redefined the groups as a whole, and bringing them down to two major groups, the Notosuchia and the Neosuchia. In the Notosuchia, there are a multitude of diverse taxids, including the aforementioned Parasaurids. Almost all Notosuchians are terrestrial animals with longer legs positioned to allow them to move much more freely along open terrain directly underneath their body. Many of them had specialized eyes and noses because of this, no longer pointing upwards to give them an edge in the aquatic environment. Instead, many of them had lowered nostrils with eyes pointing more forward, giving them a better degree of perception on land, aka binocular vision. The most basal Notosuchians are the Uruguaysuchidae. This group was restrained to areas in Africa and South America, which was once part of a single continent known as Gondwana. Once again, like the two groups preceding, these animals were fairly small and seemed to have a mainly terrestrial lifestyle. Despite not being prominent among crocs today, this was a sound strategy that worked for them for many years, able to lay claim to a niche that today is filled by small mammals, birds, and lizards. One of the most notable members of the Uruguaysuchidae is Aroripasuchus, a 6-foot, 1.8 meter long predator. Their osteoderms are rather lightweight and thin, allowing a faster movement, and their eyes are large, even for a croc. There are 6 recognized species of these animals, all falling within the same group. In a popular paper, alongside its relative Anatosuchus and several other crocodiliforms that lived in the same area, one species was nicknamed the rat croc, which is a name I often hear in reference to these guys, and honestly, they don't deserve that, they're adorable. As we travel further down the line of Notosuchians, we come across the Parasauridae and the Mahajungasuchidae, and for these guys I thought I'd bring in some backup to talk about them, the dino guy. He's been growing recently on both TikTok and YouTube and has rapidly become a great educator in the paleo space. I'll leave links to his stuff down in the description below, but go ahead and take it away, dino guy.
The Uruguaysuchidae are closely related to the next group, the Parasauridae, and their sister taxon, the Mahajungasuchidae. The Mahajungasuchids only contain 2 species, Mahajungasuchus itself and the very famous Caprasuchus, the boar croc, named for those very impressive interlocking teeth. Traditionally, these animals were considered in the Neosuchian line, but a 2014 and a subsequent 2021 study showed us they were in fact Notosuchians. Caprasuchus itself has traditionally been considered a strictly terrestrial predator, but once again, new information sheds some light on the true nature of these animals. Both animals in this small group actually show adaptation to an aquatic lifestyle, especially Mahajungasuchus. It has been suggested that these two animals both developed aquatic traits, straying away from most of the Notosuchians, who are usually terrestrial animals. Caprasuchus may have been semi-aquatic, ambushing prey from the water, and being able to chase them down if they retreated too far onto land, which of course is a very terrifying concept. These animals were fairly large and capable of tackling large prey, with Caprasuchus reaching up to 20 feet or about 6 meters in length. They were both large, bulky, and heavily built predators with powerful and large teeth made to hold on to their prey. The closest relatives to those fellows are the Pseudosuchians, once thought to be an entirely separate clade outside of Notosuchia, but now they are nestled within Notosuchia, though it still contains over 11 species. All of these species have a fairly similar body plan, however. Animals like Montielasuchus show us that these animals were not as large as some of their cousins, staying relatively small at around 2 meters or 6.5 feet long. They were still predators like many of their cousins, and would have preyed upon small animals, including our dinosaur friends. The Notosuchids and many of their relatives existed primarily in the Cretaceous, though some of them have been found in the Jurassic as well, and some have been found to have lived so recently that you'd probably be shocked. Further down the line of Notosuchians brings us to the Xiphosuchia, an incredibly interesting group. Many of the more basal Xiphosuchians are small and possess odd teeth, suggesting they lived a different lifestyle to their counterparts. These include animals like Simosuchus, the little croc relative from Madagascar that recently stole the show in Prehistoric Planet 2. Looking at the teeth, it seems these animals were herbivores rather than carnivores, and stuck with the terrestrial lifestyle. They had adapted so well to it that this particular species had adapted to use underground burrows as a form of shelter. And they weren't the only ones. Another species, Malowasuchus, is also thought to have been a burrowing animal. They truly did try everything. A more advanced group, still closely related to Simosuchus and company, were the Phytosauridae, which themselves fell under a new classification, the Xenodontosuchia. Many of them had adapted to a mammal-like jaw structure. They were small animals, with the largest reaching about 2 meters or 6.5 feet long, and they were the outliers. Many of these animals didn't exceed much more than 2 feet, about 60 centimeters long. Most of them, however, had odd mammal-like teeth. These include caniform and molariform teeth, which are usually found amongst mammals. This suggested that many of them were omnivores rather than strictly carnivores, and would have allowed them to broaden their spectrum while living with and avoiding the dinosaurs. Now here is where some more complications arise in trying to understand these animals' relationships to one another. Split off from the other Xenodontosuchians was an animal named Rauisuchians. Try to say that 5 times fast. I'm convinced I didn't even say it correctly once. I struggled. They were estimated to reach up to 7 meters long, amongst the largest of all the notosuchians, and may have occupied a niche similar to theropod dinosaurs, being a land-based predator. But they were old. Current consensus places them in the Bathonian stage of the Jurassic, around 166 million years ago. This means that fairly advanced notosuchians had evolved before the Cretaceous, when many of their forms could be found. While the species did help bridge the gap, it also opens more questions than it answers. And it doesn't stop there. Rauisuchians is thought to be one of the earliest ancestors to a group known as Sebecids. Unlike many of the other notosuchians, a majority of these animals are hypercarnivores, though they still kept the notosuchian tradition of maintaining a terrestrial lifestyle. Many of these animals were also fairly large and powerful creatures, built for big prey, and like dinosaurs, they had a laterally compressed snout, giving them binocular vision. They can be further split into 2 groups, the Broad-snouted and the Sebecids. The Broad-snouted were found in the Cretaceous, living alongside the dinosaurs and their other relatives. They were large and powerful predators and would have served a sort of middle role in the Cretaceous. They would likely act as both predator and scavenger, taking whatever opportunity came their way. Some, like Broad-snouted itself, had bent pterygoid bones, allowing them to have a powerful bite and jaws that could close rapidly, much like modern-day crocodilians. This amount of bite would have allowed them to deal a lot of damage at once when hunting prey. Unlike modern crocs, many notosuchians had adaptations to allow themselves to remain fully upright for a much longer period of time, as it would have been their primary method of locomotion. This evolution had begun some time ago in many of the Triassic pseudosuchians, shifting the hips, shoulders, and similar in these animals.
Thanks so much for that, Dino Guy, and because you said something, now I've gotta try it. Rosanna. Yeah, you were right, mate. Wasn't easy. As I said before, he's becoming a great educator, and you should definitely be checking out his stuff. I'll make sure to link it down below. This brings us to an infamous group known as the Sebecids, and their close relatives who don't quite fall into the same category. These would be 2 animals that aren't true Sebecids, being Iberosuchus and Bergisuchus. Unfortunately, both of these animals are poorly known and only represented by fragmentary remains. The remains we do have are mainly skull-based, giving us a fairly clear idea that they were in fact closely related to the Sebecids with a similar compression of the skull. Without more fossil material, however, much of these animals' lifestyles and their exact placement is kind of a mystery. Which brings us to the true Sebecids themselves, one of my personal favorite groups of notosuchians and one of my favorite groups of pseudosuchia as a whole. One of the major reasons for my favoritism is that these guys were one of the most recent groups of non-neosuchians to go extinct. The oldest member known, Ogresuchus, wasn't a very large animal. It reached just over a meter, around 3 feet in length, though it was still a carnivore, thought to have been a predator of infant sauropods. Ogresuchus appeared during the latter stages of the Cretaceous and were among the the first of what would become an iconic group. An animal known as Sebecid is the namesake for the group, as it was one of the first members discovered originally in 1937. This animal and its family were named after the Latinized version of the Egyptian god Sobek, who resembles a crocodile. Sebecids could reach up to 3 meters, around 10 feet in length, and their teeth also bear a shocking resemblance to earlier tyrannosaurids, having a robust yet blade-like design. A major benefit to the Sebecids in their early days was that they no longer lived in the shadow of the dinosaurs, which may have contributed to their rapid success. Sebecid appears in the Paleogene, appearing essentially just after the extinction event, around 60 million years ago. Several of its relatives, like Protosuchids, would also begin to appear during this time, and they would last until around the middle of the Eocene, around 35 million years ago. Sebecid and its family dominated portions of South America for some time, though they are surprisingly brought up very little compared to others. They were fast, powerful predators who dominated their land-based environment until the mammals began to take over in earnest. One remarkable taxon, Broad-snouted, was not only the largest but also the youngest member of the Sebecids. They could reach anywhere from 6 to 7.5 meters, around 20 to 25 feet in length, and weighing in at nearly 2 tons. This makes them larger than any terrestrial mammalian predator of the Cenozoic, and not just them, but any land-based predator since the dinosaurs. Broad-snouted first appears during the Eocene, around 40 million years ago, right before Sebecid was becoming extinct. However, they lasted all the way into the Miocene, around 11 million years ago, which makes them an incredibly young member of the notosuchians. On a geological timescale, that is a fairly recent time period and shows the resilience of these amazing predators, and that the reptiles didn't give up their dominance of the land so easily. Unfortunately, based on what we can tell, they were not around during the Great American Interchange, which occurred around 3 million years ago and allowed the fauna of North and South America to mix cohesively. While they obviously would have changed the American Interchange, it would have been very intriguing to see how the ecosystems balance both the Sebecids and the mammalian carnivores such as saber-toothed cats. But alas, they went extinct about 8 million years too early. And that brings us to the final major clade of the crocodylomorphs, the Notosuchia, which encompasses all modern crocodiles and their closest relatives. For these guys, we can trace many of them back all the way to the time of the dinosaurs. One thing, however, is that these animals are actually fairly well understood, which leads to more complications than you might think. Many of these animals share incredibly similar or downright copycat traits to one another, making a true classification hard, and often many studies will contradict one another. While many newer studies have come out in recent years, a lot of them are still kind of debated topics. With that being said, I will try to unravel these animals for you all as best as I can in accordance with those updated studies. The first major group I'd like to discuss is Thalattosuchia, or the marine crocodiles. They are called marine crocodiles, but while they do still fall under the Notosuchia and are closely related to true crocodiles, they are still not the true crocs as we know them. These can be further divided into two groups, the Metriorhynchoidea and the Telesauroidea. Within the Telesauroids were two other groups, the Teleosaurids and the Machimosaurids. These animals had not fully taken to the marine life and still possess many of the traits of their relatives on land. They still possess true legs, and many of them likely would have been able to climb onto land, much like modern seals. They also still possessed osteoderms, though they would take on different forms. The most basal teleosauroid was Plagiophthalmosuchus. Like many of its relatives, aside from having fully adapted to aquatic life, these animals also had incredibly long snouts, likely due to a piscivorous diet. The teleosaurs were relatively large animals, though the teleosaurids were smaller than the Machimosaurids on average. Teleosaurus itself reached around 3 meters long and weighed around 130 pounds, around 60 kilograms. Many teleosaurs are defined by an elongated snout and were likely generalist feeders, with some thought to have sought squid specifically. They heavily resemble modern gharials and some of the ancient Phytosaurs as well. It is thought that many of these animals were able to live in coastal areas, and some were even thought to have inhabited freshwater alongside their other relatives. Teleosauroids can be found as far back as the mid-Jurassic, suggesting that they evolved during the age of dinosaurs. They further advanced into two new groups, the Teleosaurine and the Aelodontinae. The Teleosaurine members, like Teleosaurus itself, had developed heavier and sturdier armor, implying that they were more semi-terrestrial and were moving back towards their roots, while the Aelodontinae had reduced and lighter osteoderms and have been found in deeper marine environments. It just shows how diverse even one group could be. The Machimosaurids evolved along a separate line, splitting from the other teleosaurids during the Jurassic. While they did survive the Jurassic and some forms can be found in the Cretaceous, they never fully recovered and would never achieve the same diversity as they had in the Jurassic. Machimosaurus itself were among the largest of the teleosaurs, with Machimosaurus reaching just over 7 meters or 23 feet in length. This made them one of the largest crocodylomorphs of the Jurassic. They had larger rear feet, likely as an adaptation to allow them better locomotion in the seas. It is thought that Machimosaurids had a more powerful tail and would have been excellent at diving. As opposed to the other teleosauroids who were more generalistic feeders, Machimosaurs had large and blunt teeth designed for crushing. It's thought that they would have sought out strong-bodied prey like turtles or even arthropods when they were younger. It has also been suggested that they could have tried to feed on land as well, as evidenced by Machimosaurus' teeth found alongside the corpse of a sauropod. However, whether this represents an actual hunt or simply scavenging is unclear at this time. Either way, this sort of niche partitioning is all too common amongst crocodylomorphs and has been a way for them to exist alongside each other for millions of years. Contrary to these semi-generalist animals, the other group of Thalattosuchia was the mainly marine Metriorhynchoidea. They had several more basal taxons like Phytosaurs who were less developed, still possessing more feet-like appendages and less specialized tails, though it was apparent they were no longer staying on land. Like the teleosauroids, they first appear in the Jurassic, but several taxons can also be found in the early parts of the Cretaceous as well. Aside from these outlying animals, the Metriorhynchoids could be distinguished by two groups, the Geosaurine and the Metriorhynchini. Of all the archosaurs, few were as well adapted to oceanic life than these two advanced forms of crocodylomorph. Instead of the strong and bony osteoderms, they adopted a body plan not unlike other marine reptiles. They lost the armor, instead taking on a more smooth skin type, almost like an ichthyosaur. Their legs had adapted to become more paddle-like, and they developed a tail fluke for better propulsion through the water. Intriguingly, it is also believed that they gave live birth like many other marine reptiles, mammals, and even sharks, as their reduced limbs would have not allowed them on land, and they had a wider and taller hip opening than other pseudosuchians. Looking at these two groups, one major thing that separates them is their skulls. The Metriorhynchini have more elongated skulls, similar to the teleosaurs. This suggested that they once again were either more generalized feeders or that they would have more often targeted small fish, squid, and other soft-bodied prey. They were likely extremely fast predators, as their bodies were no longer weighed down by the osteoderms, and their specialized tails would have made it easier for them to chase down the fast and small prey. Most of these animals were not exceptionally large, likely reaching around 3 meters or 10 feet in length. The Geosaurines were another story entirely. Instead of long, thin snouts, they once again had switched it up, having shorter snouts overall, resembling that of mosasaurs. Geosaurus itself had one such skull with large, sharp, and serrated teeth rather than the small pointed teeth of their relatives. One taxon, the Docosaurus, has had its teeth compared to modern killer whales in terms of proportions and suggested they were among the top predators of their time. Geosaurus, like its relatives, only reached around 3 meters in length, but in this case that was not the maximum size for this group. Some animals like Plesiosuchus could reach far larger, nearly 6 meters or more, upwards of 20 feet. This would make them powerful predators in the early Cretaceous and late Jurassic, and allow them to tackle far larger prey. On top of that, because of their lack of osteoderms, they were also incredibly fast and agile swimmers. Because they were focused on larger prey, this allowed them to share territory with the Metriorhynchini, something we call niche partitioning. Seeking two different sources of food reduced competition and would allow them to coexist, which is niche partitioning in a nutshell. That being said, the larger Geosaurines may have hunted the Metriorhynchini if the opportunity arose. Going out of the sea and back to the land brings us to the next group, though this one is one of the most hotly debated groups. In the past, this group was separated into three, being the Elosuchids, the Phylidosaurs, and the Dinosaurs. In 1982, it was suggested that a new group was made, the Tethisuchia, as many of these animals shared similarities with one another. However, for many years, Tethisuchia was considered synonymous with the other groups and therefore not used until 2011 when it was revived. However, despite its revival, many studies still haven't used Tethisuchia, and its current status remains in the air. The only one I've noticed is a 2019 study that supported the revival of Tethisuchia and placed the three aforementioned groups within. The exact placement of these groups is still a hotly debated topic. Either way, this group evolved along a separate line and gave us some interesting animals. Most of these animals retain their basic pseudosuchian body plan and still possess their osteoderms. One of these groups are the Phytosauridae, whose exact members remain somewhat debated. The Elosuchus is thought to be closely related to this group, leading to some of their members to have been classified as elosuchids in the past. Today, Elosuchidae are now considered to be monophyletic, meaning it only contains a single genus. Phytosaurids heavily resemble modern gharials and first appear during the early stages of the Cretaceous around 145 million years ago. The incredibly popular crocodiliform Sarcosuchus is considered to be a Phytosaur. It's no surprise that Sarcosuchus is an incredibly popular animal due to size alone. These massive animals could reach up to 30 feet and reach nearly 5 tons, but Sarcosuchus is an outlier in its own family. Sarcosuchus and the other Phytosaurs were thought to be semi-aquatic like modern crocs, and as you can see, they have a relatively long snout, again like modern gharials. Most of this group, like Phytosaurus itself, use this long snout as a fishing tool, just as many others with a similar skull plan. Sarcosuchus, however, was a more generalistic predator, occupying a similar niche to what crocs would become famous for today. You've no doubt seen images over time of these massive crocs attacking and eating dinosaurs, and those images are actually fairly correct. Sarcosuchus in both Africa and South America lived alongside giants in the form of dinosaurs in the early Cretaceous. This massive size allowed them to take advantage of a potentially unique food source, dinosaurs. Interestingly, how they would have processed these giant prey items is still unknown, likely from lateral shakes of its head, because a 2014 biomechanical study showed us that Sarcosuchus was not capable of the crocodile's famous death roll, and therefore would have had to tear pieces off of their prey in a different manner. Despite not being a true crocodile, they are incredibly close on terms of appearance and the behavior we expect to see. Closely related to the Phytosaurs and taking on a variety of forms, we have the Dirosauridae. The earliest known specimens first arose in the Cenomanian, the earliest days of the last stage in the Cretaceous, around 100 million years ago. Thanks to a few key specializations, they achieved a near global distribution during this time, which allowed them to survive the Cretaceous and move into the Paleogene. One major advantage was their tolerance to salt water, similar to the Thalattosuchians. Unlike their cousins, however, they did not fully transition to marine life and rather became much like modern saltwater crocodiles, traversing the coastal marine environments and likely the open ocean on certain occasions. These animals had a variety of traits, and many of them had different shaped snouts. Most commonly, they once again had long and narrower snouts like gharials, likely due to the semi-marine lifestyle. However, they had specialized interlocking teeth which would make it far more difficult for their prey to escape. They do this through what are known as occlusal pits in their jaws. Some of these animals stayed on land, occupying freshwater habitats instead, but a majority of them were seagoers. Studies have shown that they had osteoporotic bones, meaning their bones were spongy and porous like modern cetaceans or turtles. This lightens the load, so to speak, allowing them to be maneuverable animals while still maintaining their protective coating of osteoderms. One of the smaller animals, Serjonisuchus, was found to live in said freshwater environments during the Paleogene and would have lived alongside the massive Titanoboa. While this may sound like bad news for the croc, recent analysis has shown that Titanoboa may have been a mainly piscivorous animal and may not have tried to tackle relatively large armored prey. One of the larger Dirosaurids, Phytosaurus, is an outlier. Once again, it seems to be a trend that the larger animals in these groups become less specialized and more focused on generalistic prey. Such is the case with Phytosaurus. Estimated to reach up to 9 meters or 30 feet in length, they still had a long and somewhat narrow snout, but it widened towards the rear. As opposed to thin and long teeth, they had much more powerful and blunter teeth, likely used to break through the tough exterior of marine animals like turtles. The drastic difference in the environment, behavior, and appearance of these animals is a testament to their longevity. Moving away from the Phytosaurs and Dirosaurs, that brings us to our next three groups. While not part of a single unit, these animals all share a more recent common ancestor with one another than they do with any of the other groups. This leads them to be individual families closely related to each other. The first of these are the Atoposaurids, small predatory animals. They resemble armored monitor lizards, though they didn't get very large. Some of them, like Atoposaurus itself, reached around 17 centimeters, around 6.5 inches. They were around in the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous and likely preyed upon small mammals, early birds, and insects. These little crocs kept their armor, making them a tougher bite to chew than most. Their legs were also relatively long, as they had evolved for terrestrial life. The next group, and the closest related to true crocodiles, were the Goniophilididae. I know, it sounds kinda gross, but I didn't name them. These animals share a very close resemblance to crocodiles as we know them, but one of the key differences lays in their armor. Goniophilids had only 2 pairs of wide, rectangular osteoderms along their back, where modern crocs have 4 pairs. Another curious difference is that their front legs are usually the same size or longer than the rear, which is the opposite for extant crocs. They first appear in the middle of the Triassic and persisted on into the Cretaceous. While we do know that they were around in the early Cretaceous, there has been some speculation that one genus, Denisenosuchus, was a goniopholid. If that's the case, it would show that these animals persisted into the latter days of the Cretaceous alongside many other members of their family. These animals were moderately sized, not truly giant, but not small either, reaching around 3.5 meters on average, about 12 feet. Goniopholus itself is one of these, and like many crocodiles, they would have been semi-aquatic ambush hunters. They had many of the same adaptations as modern crocs, allowing them to submerge themselves for long periods of time while lying in wait. They would eventually die off in the Cretaceous, however, while some of their cousins continued to thrive. Continuing further down the same line, we get to the stomatosuchids, a very odd family of crocs. Two taxons are here, Stomatosuchus itself and Laganosuchus. Both species appear and disappear within the latter days of the Cretaceous. Stomatosuchids have a very large head with an almost bill-like shape. Their skulls were long and flattened, and in life it may have had a pouch similar to a pelican to hold food or water. Their teeth were small and conical in shape. Combined with their pouch, it suggested a diet that heavily relied on fish or other aquatic prey. Stomatosuchus is also a rather large animal, reaching upwards of 10 meters or 33 feet in length. Despite this size, with their mouth they may have stayed still and simply waited for food to pass into their jaws. Such a large mouth could cover a lot of area, and pressure sensors along their body could help them detect when prey does in fact approach. They were an interesting and unique group of animals. Aside from a few poorly understood neosuchians such as the Alligatoridae, which resemble modern crocs even more closely, this brings us to the Eusuchia. This is one of the most important family of crocodilians today, as this is the group that would eventually produce Crocodilia, the family all modern crocodilians fall into. Alongside the Dinosaurids and the Sebecid, they were one of the only groups to survive the KPG extinction. It possessed three major groups, Atoposaurids, the Hyliochampidae, and the crown group Crocodilia. The most primitive of these, the Hyliochampidae, had shortened snouts and complex teeth for a crocodilian. These teeth are known as multicuspid, similar to our own molars. Combined with their short snout but relatively thick head, this means they were likely herbivores who ate tough and fibrous plant material. Like many of the other herbivorous crocodiliforms, these animals were not very large, with the largest animal thought to reach just over a meter, coming in just shy of 4 feet long. They lived during the Cretaceous, first appearing in the early Cretaceous around 125 million years ago, and they disappear with many of their family in the late Cretaceous. This particular group disappears from the fossil record about 85 million years ago. The next group is known as the Allidaposuchids, with animals like Allidaposuchus itself and Lohuecosuchus, both of which happen to be from Europe. Allidaposuchus is actually one of the most common crocs in Europe during the late Cretaceous, suggesting that they were a rather successful group. Like many others, their exact placement remains debated. Many consider them to be along the crocodile line, but not true crocodilians themselves, while others have recovered them as some of the most basal true crocodilians. They certainly share a lot of traits with true crocodiles. Aside from a basic body plan, osteoderms, and other common traits, a scan of the brain case of Lohuecosuchus showed us that they would have had a powerful sense of smell and the ability to pick up on low-frequency sounds. This is something that modern crocs have taken advantage of and suggests that if they are not true crocs, that these traits evolved earlier along the lineage, though where is still unclear. Like the goniopholids, still don't like that name by the way, they were moderately sized animals, reaching an average of 3 meters, just shy of 10 feet. However, there has been suggested larger sizes for Lohuecosuchus, but the material is fragmentary and only possesses a skull in completion. These animals are also notable for having rather large legs from what we do have, and were thought to have been able to hunt on land or at least traverse land for longer periods of time than their modern relatives, which is pretty fascinating. And this brings us to a few other taxa just outside of Crocodilia. To transition us into these animals, I brought on a buddy of mine, paleontologist Harrison Duran. Harrison spends a lot of the time in the field, collecting fossils and data, and most of that time is spent in a place known as Hell Creek, one of North America's most famous fossil formations. Hell Creek has been vastly studied, but there's always new and intriguing things we can find, and for that stuff you can always check out Harrison's page. He and his team make incredible content, especially whenever they have a new find, and they always use it as an opportunity to educate folks. I'll make sure to leave a link for their content down below, but for now, go ahead and take us away, Harrison.
Welcome to the Badlands of South Dakota. Within these sand and mudstone formations are my dig sites. And here, scattered amongst some bone, we have the osteoderm of a crocodile. Now this could be from Brachycampsa, Thoracosaurus, or Borealisuchus.
Thank you very much for that, Harrison, and he's confident it belongs to one of those animals because they are the most common crocodilians in Hell Creek. He does have some more crocodile material he's preparing currently, so make sure to check out his page to see even more. But this brings us to the animals themselves. The first of these animals are the Thoracosaurs. Consisting of several genera, the most prominent among these is Thoracosaurus itself, of course. They were a relatively large animal and fairly successful as well in their native environments of Europe and North America. Reaching around 4.5 meters long, about 15 feet, they were once again like large gharials. They had a long and pointed snout, no doubt useful in snatching up fish and other aquatic prey. It has been suggested that Thoracosaurus could have been a semi-marine animal, as it is often found in coastal environments in places like Hell Creek. This would open up their menu significantly, as well as give them other resources to reduce competition with other crocs in their territory. Also residing in Hell's Creek is another animal that isn't a true crocodile but resembles them heavily in Borealisuchus. They were around the same size as Thoracosaurus but had been built in a much different manner. Instead of a long and narrow snout, it had a traditional crocodilian snout that we would come to expect in a sort of triangle shape. These are the closest related animals to the crocodilia that aren't true crocs themselves. 6 species of Borealisuchus are recognized, and they were one of the survivors of the extinction event. First appearing at the end of the Cretaceous around 70 million years ago, these animals were more successful in the days following and would last into the Eocene around 35 million years ago. The early Borealisuchus species would have had to live in the shadow of the dinosaurs before really getting a chance to dominate afterwards. However, their cousins turned out to be far more successful, and in the end, they too would disappear. These impressive animals likely hunted just like modern crocs, waiting and watching from below the surface of the water. And finally, that brings us to the modern crocodilians and everything that encompasses. But that, folks, is where we're going to end the video this time. Next time, we'll kick off with the true crocodile, so stay tuned because you won't want to miss it. Thank you all for joining me once again. As always, it is very much appreciated, and a double thank you for waiting so very patiently for this video to come out. Make sure to check out part 2 when it's released, and check out my collaborators on this video. Thank you all so very much for watching. Remember to be good people, drink plenty of water, and have a fantastic day. Welcome to the history of crocodiles, this time where we talk about the modern groups and their direct relatives. We've got a couple collabs and a plethora of information coming up in this video, and I'm sorry it took me so long to get it out, but I'm sure you can see why it did with how long it is. Regardless, I hope you all enjoyed this glimpse into these ancient animals' past. Crocodilia, the family that encompasses all modern crocs, also encompasses all extinct true crocodiles as well. This main family can be split into 3 categories: the Alligatoroidea, the Longirostris, and the Planocranidae. The Planocranidae are a group that is uncertainly placed, just like so many others. Formerly, this group was known as the Pristachampsidae. However, when Pristachampus was found to be a nomen dubium in 2013, this group was revived to take its place. Some scientists consider them to be just outside the crown group rather than true crocs themselves, alongside animals like Borealisuchus. However, most studies have found that they belong to the true crocodiles as a sister group to the Longirostris. These animals are sometimes called hoofed crocodiles due to the blunt claws that do somewhat resemble hooves. This suggested that they would have run in a similar manner to hoofed mammals on the tips of their toes, which could give them a faster running speed. These animals are also notable because once again crocs were venturing out of the water and onto land, but this time in the true crown group. They were considered to be terrestrial, having long limbs held under the body and giving them an upright stance. Once again, instead of having flattened heads, their heads were more compressed and allowed them a better field of view, not relying on a watery ambush. These animals first appeared directly after the Cretaceous extinction, attempting to claim dominance in the early days of the Paleocene, and they at least partially held on to it, lasting until around the mid-Eocene around 40 million years ago. Part of their success can be attributed to, of course, their armor. Compared to the rest of their family, their armor was far more extensive, with osteoderms on their legs and completely encasing their tail. With the dinosaurs gone, these 10-foot-long armored predators would have been one of the top dogs, at least for a while. The Alligatoroidea is considered to be the most primitive lineage of true crocodiles. They are thought to have split from the other lineages around 80 to 100 million years ago, with 3 primitive species known before other lineages began to form within those primitive alligatoroids. Two of the earliest known are Lineosuchus and Dinosuchus, arguably the most famous of the extinct crocodiles. You already know Dinosuchus is an absolutely massive animal and one of, if not the top contender for the largest pseudosuchians of all time. Current official estimates place them at around 36 feet, just shy of 11 meters in length, though there are some who claim it could reach upwards of 40 feet or 12 meters long. However, this is still up in the air and needs to be studied in depth. They would have appeared very similar to modern alligators, but with some differences aside from their massive size. Their snout is unique among all crocodilians, being more robust and wider at the front. Their osteoderms were uniquely large and contained many pits and grooves for muscle attachments, allowing them better maneuverability both on land and in the water. Dinosuchus first appeared about 80 million years ago, and during its time it dominated North American freshwater. Using the tried and true method we all know and love today, these massive predators would have ambushed and hunted large dinosaurs. With a bite force estimated between 10 and 23,000 pounds per square inch, it may have had a stronger bite than the infamous Tyrannosaurus rex, and once its jaws locked around prey, it was pretty much over. That being said, the reason I said may is some of the upper estimates for their bite force may be exaggerated, as they were based on skull size alone, comparing it to modern-day saltwater crocodiles. There would be other factors that would need to be considered as well, like muscle density, teeth, and attachment areas. Unlike Sarcosuchus and earlier crocodylomorphs, these massive predators were in fact able to use the infamous death roll, tearing their prey apart bit by bit. Their rear teeth were also well suited to crushing prey, showing us that like modern alligators, they had a diverse selection of prey that they could choose from. These early alligatoroids dominated during their time, giving way to the rest of their family's success. As we go even further down this line, we reach a group called the Globiodonta, the line that would lead to both alligators and caimans. Some more recent studies have placed both Dinosuchus and Lineosuchus as the most basal members of this group, but most studies still seem to consider them to be outside of it. The most primitive confirmed Globiodonts are Brachychampsa and Stangerochampsa. Both taxons appear at the end of the Cretaceous, around 66 million years ago. They were relatively small animals, characterized by rather long legs and teeth designed for crushing prey. This would allow them to niche partitions with the other crocs around them, as Brachychampsa would have shared territory with the likes of Thoracosaurus and Borealisuchus. Instead of focusing on fish or even dinosaurs, these small gators focused on shellfish and possibly small turtles. Shellfish were incredibly common in the waterways of the time, including mussels and clams, and would have been their main food source more than likely. It has been suggested that many of these primitive alligatoroids with their long legs would have been at least partially able to come onto the land for hunting or similar. However, some folks don't consider these animals globiodonts. Some studies have placed Brachychampsa and its relative as stem caimans instead, and some of the earliest examples of true caimans. This is based on their similarity in their skull and jaw structure and would show that true alligators would have already evolved during the late Cretaceous. That being said, this is still up in the air, like most things with crocs, so it could go either way. Before we move on, two other animals arose again as basal globiodonts. However, this has also been debated heavily. The two animals in question are Ceratosuchus and Navajosuchus. Some studies have placed them as globiodonts, and others have placed them as some of the most basal alligatorini, true alligators. At around 2 meters, they aren't very large animals and would have served a moderate role in the early days following the Cretaceous extinction. First appearing around 60 million years ago, these mid-sized predators were sticking to the water, something that we recognize as the norm for crocs today. Ceratosuchus itself is notable as the only horned crocodilian. These small horns would have given an almost dragon-esque appearance to the animal. Unlike many horns in the animal kingdom, these ones would not have been useful in combat. Rather, they were likely for two main reasons. The first, of course, is mating purposes. It's thought that these large horns may represent a healthier individual and may boost their chances in mating. The second is species recognition. Ceratosuchus shared its territory with other members of its family, including the primitive alligator Allignathosuchus. These horns would make it easier for them to identify one another, likely for mating or territorial purposes. Whether they are true alligators or not is still up to debate overall. In contrast to the globiodonts, another not well understood group known as the Orientalosuchini were rising in Asia. These primitive alligatoroids were thought to be the Asian equivalent to animals like Brachychampsa, with blunt teeth designed for crushing, a short and wide skull, and an overall smaller body plan. These include animals like Eoalligator and the more recently discovered Eurycephalus. These Asian taxons are thought to be more land-based than their North American counterparts, and they take the skull plan of animals like Brachychampsa to the extreme. Specifically, if we look at Eurycephalosukis, we find that their head is extremely specialized, and if we look further, we see that it shared territory with a yet unidentified crocodilian. Their specialized skull likely allowed them into a niche that separated them from this other, seemingly larger crocodilian, which is not uncommon at all, and it really just goes to show the lengths nature will go to make sure that two animals don't directly compete with each other unless absolutely necessary. Most people forget that to animals, life is a great game of survival, and sometimes the smarter play is to not get into direct competition. It's really just fascinating, to be honest. This brings us to the true alligators, including the species we know today. The crown group Alligatoridae represents two major groups, the Alligatorini and the Caimani, the alligators and the caimans. Despite being a relatively well-understood family of animals, the exact placement for numerous animals is still highly debated and leaves some of them in uncertain placements. Starting with the alligators, the oldest confirmed members appeared just after the Cretaceous extinction, with animals like Allignathosuchus appearing around 60 million years ago, splitting off from the caimans around the same time. They spread all across North America in those early days, and it's thought that many of the Asian alligator species crossed over during this time after the dinosaurs, similar to how Asian and American tyrannosaurs did during the Cretaceous. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier with the Orientalosuchini, there is a significant lack of fossil material in Asia for its ancient alligators and their relatives, leaving their origins somewhat cloudier than they normally would be. In North America, alligators diversified the most as far as we're aware, but that might not be true considering we don't have a lot of information from Asia. North American alligators diverged so much, in fact, that at one point alligators began to cross over to Europe during the Eocene, giving rise to several extinct alligatorines from the region like Aramborgia. Now here's where things become a little more confusing. Several species of alligators would arise during the following period of time, including the two modern species that we know today. The extinct species that I'll list up above here are all still true alligators, but they had a few differences from the gators that we all know and love to separate them. Alligator prenasalis is considered to be the most primitive based on its much more simple skull. They are also the oldest confirmed true alligators, being around 40 million years old. Some, like Alligator mcgrewi, is known to have been fragmentary and is thought to have been significantly smaller than modern American alligators, likely around the same size as Chinese alligators. A species from Florida, Alligator olseni, is thought to have preceded American alligators and may be directly ancestral to them, but we're not entirely sure. None of these early gators were as large as the modern American alligator, but one unique animal rose in Asia to show that size wasn't really everything. To talk about this unique and interesting animal as well as the American alligator, I've brought on someone who lives nearby and has worked closely with these alligators. A fantastic wildlife educator, this is Dean with DNA Reptiles. He regularly works closely with reptiles and other animals and is an avid educator. I highly recommend checking out his content, and I'll make sure to leave a link to it down below. But go ahead, Dean, introduce us to this creature.
Hey guys, this is the Chinese alligator, A. sinensis. And originally, due to the bony plate above their eyelid, these animals were thought to be closely related to caimans when they were first described in the 1800s. There's still discourse today on whether or not these guys belong to the genus of alligators. These guys first appeared in the Pliocene about 3 million years ago, making them a pretty young species, even younger than the American alligator. Despite being so young, these guys are thought to have thrived throughout a big portion of Asia before human settlement really began to spread in the region. These guys are actually relatively small compared to other crocodilians. They max out at about 8 feet. It's about 2.5 meters for all you non-freedom unit using people. And unlike American alligators, they do not have webbed feet, despite spending the majority of their time in the water. It has a short and broad snout and is considered to be the most docile of all the crocodilians. It is thought that they would never attack a person unless provoked or desperate. And uniquely, unlike the American alligator, their osteoderms go around their entire body, including their belly. Very similar to the ancient pseudosuchians. And like many other croc species, these guys are extremely adept at digging, and will actually do so in the winter by constructing burrows. During the winter, Chinese alligators will go through a process called brumation, which is like a reptile version of hibernation. Instead of completely shutting down their body, they slow down their metabolism, and they will go for months without eating. Many snake owners who live in colder climates, I will have to say, here in Florida, we're going through a cold spell right now, and it's like, I want to say it's like 30 degrees this morning. absolutely freezing. The snakes here even go into brumation, even though it's Florida. People don't think of it like that. But anyway, it's just the reptile version of hibernation, and they will come out to do a few things like drink, and then they go right back and go into their deep sleep and just kind of shut everything down and just chill out until it gets warm again. This species also thermoregulates pretty well, it seems, because they only bask for a short period of time and are mostly active at night. And the majority of their diet is shellfish, especially snails and fish. But unfortunately, like many members of its family, these ancient animals are in danger of human prejudice. Due to extensive poaching for their skins and loss of their native range, Chinese alligators are one of the most endangered species on the planet, with only about 120 actually living in the wild. It's not all doom and gloom though. An extensive breeding program was put forward in 2016. It already has 15,000 Chinese alligators. These are being slowly released back into the wild, and there has been some success. These minuscule crocs are amazing and very placid creatures, and I cannot wait to see them make a rebound. American alligators, the one that you probably know the most, are a whole other ballgame. These predators from the southern United States have been here far longer than we have. First arising about 8 million years ago. By 3 million years ago, these guys were all over the southern United States. And part of their large success here in the northern hemisphere is their tolerance for the cold. Unlike most crocodilians who don't handle the cold well at all, American alligators can stand temperatures of 45 degrees or lower without really showing any signs of slowing down. Even when the water that they're living in freezes over, they can stick their snout out of the water and survive completely frozen as long as they got that air coming through. And like the Chinese alligator, this is a form of brumation. And just like the Chinese alligator, they are able to dig large burrows. And this is a rather important thing for the American alligator. It helps make them a keystone species. And the reason is that they will create gator holes in their wetland environments. Now, these holes will retain water during the drier seasons. And the water helps not only the alligators, but a multitude of other species. That these water holes will help them survive throughout the drier times. And especially in the Everglades, it does get dry during the summer. Shoot, this past year, half of the Everglades was the driest it had ever been, while the other half was the wettest. It was weird, but the alligators helped keep a lot of those animals that were in those drier times and help them survive. Now, one of the main restrictions that alligators have that most people don't really know is that they do not have salt glands. They cannot remove the salt from the water they take in. And because of this, they don't really adventure outside of fresh water. They practically only stay in fresh water. Every once in a while during a storm, they'll get flushed out of a river or a stream, and I've seen them in brackish and salt water, but it's not normal, and they don't do that well for very long, and they do their best to get back into that fresh water. Otherwise, there's a good chance that the salt will actually blind them, and unfortunately, if they're in there too long, they'll probably die. But this keeps them separate from the American crocodile, which can do very well in salt water. American alligators are one of the largest species of crocodilia alive today, with adult males getting around 11 to 15 feet long, or 3.3 to 4.6 meters. So it's kind of rare to see them at that size. The average big male that I tend to see is about 10 to 11 feet. There, of course, are a lot of sightings of larger alligators than this, but it's very hard to document these, and unless they're measured, they pretty much are never bigger than 15 feet. The only one that could be considered somewhat reliable was a report of an alligator shot in the Everglades that was 17 feet 5 inches. That's about 5.3 meters. Only exceptional specimens can reach that size. And interesting, American alligators are one of the animals that are fighting back against a lot of the invasive species such as Burmese pythons, hogs, and my favorite, domestic house cats. I don't know if you could tell if that was sarcasm or not. And due to their role as the apex predator, outside of humans, they are the ones that are impacted by the invasive species the most. And it should be noted that some invasives, like the Burmese pythons, once they get to a certain size, can easily eat baby alligators. And alligators, in turn, will eat the Burmese pythons, but it's a constant battle back and forth, and they can only do so much. And we need help however we can to get rid of those invasive species down there. Not just the scaly ones, but the furry ones too. Keep your cats inside, please. But speaking of which, the American alligator was almost driven to extinction. American alligators were hunted at an incredibly unsustainable rate in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And by the 1960s, they were on the verge of extinction and were missing from the majority of their original range. In 1967, the US government banned the hunting of American alligators completely. And over the next 20 years, US Fish and Wildlife worked extensively to conserve the American alligator and also reintroducing them back into the wild. And thanks to this amazing service, in 1987, the American alligator was taken off of the endangered species list and is considered fully recovered. American alligator hunting is actually legal. Not only is it legal, but it is very sustainable. I've done it myself. Alligator tastes amazing. I love them. Sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. But, as I said before, it is completely sustainable practice compared to the complete mess it was before. The American alligator is actually considered one of the best success stories ever in conservation. And like the American alligator, a lot of animals have been taken off of the endangered species list because of efforts that were made that were just like the American alligator. And here in Florida in particular, there are well over 1 million alligators. 1 million just in this state. The last thing I want to talk about with alligators is something they have in common with the mugger crocodiles. Both species are known to use rudimentary tools in assistance with their hunts. During any bird nesting seasons, they will hold a stick in their mouth or even just have it right on top of their nose. And they'll wait just below the surface and wait for a bird to come by to grab it to use in their nest. This is a very interesting behavior, and it does hint at some higher intelligence of some sort to be able to put two and two together, that stick and bird equals food.
Thank you so very much for that, Dean, and like I said, make sure you check out his page with the links down below. And just to add about the alligator's success, I think it really goes to show that we can do more and aid these animals that we keep driving close to extinction if we really focus our minds to it. And hopefully more crocodilians who are on the verge of extinction can make a drastic recovery, just like the alligator. Alligators are one of the most famous and notable groups of crocodilians today, but I personally think that they heavily overshadow their cousins, who are just as impressive in my opinion. The direct cousins of the alligators would be the caiman, usually considered the smallest of the crocs and one of the more diverse groups that are still around today. Unlike many groups of crocs, their range is rather exclusive. Caimans can be found in Central and South America and as far north as Mexico. Most of these animals are relatively small as far as crocodylomorphs go, with a few notable exceptions, including some extinct caimans. I mentioned earlier that some studies consider Brachychampsa as one of the earliest true caimans and one of the most basal members of this group. If that is true, these caimans would find their origins during the Cretaceous, just before the fall of the dinosaurs. If it's not true, then the earliest known caiman otherwise is Eocaiman, first appearing around 60 million years ago. These primitive caimans would have been among the great rush of animals vying for a spot on top before they eventually settled into a more mediary role. One of the other early caimans, Sebecid, shows us that these animals had already begun to diversify heavily and spread into Central and North America by around 52 million years ago. Caiman origins, as we know them, show us that caimans first split off from the alligatorids likely during or just after the Cretaceous. It would have had to have been at a time where there would have been passable islands or a form of land, as caimans have a low tolerance for salt water today compared to other members of their family, though we're not sure if that was a trait they lost over time. Another theory suggests that caimans went south before the Cretaceous even ended, and some animals survived on both sides of North and South America. This would make Sebecid descended directly from a North American population of caimans rather than having their origins in South America. This brings us to the crown group of caimans and to where most of the modern animals are classified. However, there are 6 extinct taxons here as well. The first of these that I want to talk about is no doubt the Purosaurus. This was the largest known caiman with 3 known species. Early estimates, like with many giant extinct crocs, gave them all sorts of fantastical and whimsical numbers. Modern estimates still place them as incredibly large creatures though, between 33 to 35 feet, around 10 to 10.6 meters in length. They were incredibly heavily built, with a large and broad head as well as a bulky body. This has placed them in contest with Dinosuchus for the title of largest croc ever. A study published in 2015 shows us they had one of the most powerful confirmed bite forces of any animal, reaching upwards of 15,000 pounds per square inch, more than 7 metric tons of force. But the dinosaurs were gone, so what did this massive animal even eat? Purosaurus lived around 16 million years ago, during the Miocene, and during this time its main source of of food would have been mammals. These would especially include the now extinct notoungulates and the xenarthrans, who are still around today. These animals, like many others, used to be much larger. In this group of animals were things like the giant ground sloth and glyptodonts. In notoungulates, there were great beasts like Toxodon, but there were also smaller members too. But it mattered little to Purosaurus, because these massive animals would have been the apex of their environment and likely had no natural predators themselves. But like so many other giants, they faced one real problem: themselves. Like so many other of the great giants that roamed our planet, or the amazing predators like Smilodon and Megalodon, Purosaurus was over-specialized. Its giant size made it almost untouchable in any sort of physical bout, and as such it required giant prey as well. Even that withstanding, its size gave it another disadvantage besides food: environment. Current consensus believes that this constantly changing environment in South America favored smaller caimans more, and as their large prey disappeared and their environment shifted around them, these giants were left behind, going extinct around 5 million years ago. But contrary to what most people seem to think, Purosaurus wasn't the only giant caiman. At the same time it lived, another animal, Morasuchus, also arose. Like the aforementioned Stomatosuchus, these odd caimans had a long and flattened skull, with many equating it to a duck almost. 4 species of this odd-looking caiman are known, and their size has been up for debate for a while. No matter what, when it comes to comparing them to modern caimans, Morasuchus was larger than most. Early estimates placed the largest species of Morasuchus at 31 feet, 9.5 meters, which would make it one of the largest crocodilians known. However, more recent studies took another look at their body and compared them exclusively to known caiman species. With that method, we instead got a maximum size of around 6 meters or 20 feet in length, longer than any modern caimans. However, it's important to note that all of these estimates are based on the fragmentary remains and comparative analysis. New fossil material would definitely help shed light on exactly how large these animals were. One of the most interesting things about Morasuchus was how they fed. 3 main theories have been suggested. One of these were that they were specialized to aquatic plant life instead of meat and were herbivores rather than carnivores. While certainly not impossible, it seems unlikely overall. Another theory was that it simply laid in wait, almost like snapping turtles, and perhaps waited for the prey to swim past their open jaws. But the theory that seems to have garnered the most support is that they were a sort of filter feeder or sift feeder. It is thought that they could have used these massive jaws like a shovel, scooping up sediment and filtering out the food from within. You may have seen something similar in the most recent season of Prehistoric Planet. This method would allow them to eat a plethora of smaller animals and may have been a way for them to niche partitions with animals like Purosaurus. Like their bigger cousin, they too disappeared around the same time, suggesting that they also could not cope with the changes in their environment. Now, this brings us to the modern groups of caiman, but you might be surprised to learn that the most basal of these animals are actually still around today. The most primitive caimans are the smooth-fronted caiman and Cuvier's dwarf caiman. These two are both classified under the genus Paleosuchus, which is thought to have diverged from other caimans some 30 million years ago. This means they may be even older than the extinct species like Purosaurus. They are very closely related to one another and represent the last of a very old line. Also, whoever decided to call these the smooth-fronted caiman and Cuvier's dwarf caiman and not Paleosuchus, I don't know what you were thinking, bro, but that ain't it. I understand common names are a thing for a reason, but come on, Paleosuchus is such a cool name. Also, I'll be honest, looking at both of these crocs in photos, I think they would be some of the most terrifying crocs ever, if they weren't so small. These two are the smallest living members of the alligatorids as a whole, smaller on average than even the Chinese alligator. Smooth-fronted caimans are known to reach a maximum average of around 5 feet, around 1.5 meters. However, notably, large males have reached up to around 7.5 feet, nearly 2.5 meters. As for Cuvier's caiman, they are the smallest living species, and you may have seen them kept as pets by several different folks across social media. They reach around the same maximum as the smooth-fronted caiman, but are smaller on average, and the largest ever was recorded at only 5.7 feet, around 1.7 meters long. Both of these species share traits with one another not found in other groups, including a more powerful and durable set of osteoderms. It is thought that these large and heavy osteoderms are to help reduce predation on these animals, as their smaller size makes them far more vulnerable, and that just gives them a slight advantage in that field. The smooth-fronted caiman is known mainly to hunt on land, and doesn't hunt many fish or aquatic prey as far as we're aware. Though it does spend a large portion of its time in and around the water, it is known to mainly hunt animals like snakes, birds, and lizards on the land, and they are one of the only known predators of the South American porcupine. Unlike many of their relatives, these animals do not seem particularly fond of the sun. Even in captivity, they are rarely seen basking and spend much of their day hiding or submerged. While they never stray too far from the water overall, these animals are known to spend significant portions of time away from the water, hunting in the dense jungles where it can lie in wait. While many crocs are under threat all over the world like the American alligator, smooth-fronted caimans are actually not one of them. There are thought to be over 1 million of these animals in the wild today, and they are still heavily regulated under international law. Another major reason that they are thought not to be endangered is because they can't be hunted because of their powerful armor. Their armor is incredibly heavy and bony, and these animals don't make good leather on account of their small size and large armor, a neat adaptation to protect them from human greed. That protection stretches to Cuvier's caiman as well, as their large and powerful armor makes it difficult to obtain a good amount of leather, again protecting them from human greed. Aside from environmental impacts, these guys are doing fairly well in the wild to the point that they have been extensively collected for the pet trade and still doing okay. People, of course, always have doubts about the pet trade, but it is possible to keep these animals responsibly and well, as shown by many different folks online, but it is not a pet I recommend for most unless you have a lot of room and a lot of money to spare. In contrast to the smooth-fronted caiman, Cuviers are more focused on aquatic prey such as fish and mollusks, but like most crocs, they are opportunistic and will take the most types of prey if they can get their jaws on it. They are also mostly nocturnal and hunt during the night, and during the dry season they do something similar to the Chinese alligator. Instead of brumation, where the animal goes into a state of dormancy due to colder temperatures, these animals go through something known as aestivation. This usually takes place during the summer rather than the winter, and only during extremely dry seasons. Like Chinese alligators, Cuvier's caiman will create a burrow for themselves in the summer, slowing down their metabolism and requirement for food before the wet season returns and they go back to normal. Like the American alligators, these guys are also considered a keystone species, but not for the same reason. A plethora of fish are spread across this caiman's territory, and many of them are kept in check by this predator. Because of how much it focuses on aquatic prey, it is thought that without these guys, many other species might become too widespread and cause havoc among the Amazon ecosystem. They are sort of nature's balance for many different species. Moving on from the primitive boys, we go to some of the more recent additions. We are going to try to leave everything in their natural groupings as we talk about them, and the spectacled caiman and the yakare caiman are two closely related animals, so much so that they are often confused for the same animal as each other, and some scientists place them within the same genus. They are almost indistinguishable in terms of morphology, but they are slightly better adapted for their respective environments. Spectacled caimans are more common in the northern parts of South America, and yakare caimans are more common in the south. These are some of the most common animals people think of when they think of caimans, as they are moderately sized and lightly built compared to some of their counterparts. The main predator of these animals are jaguars and anacondas, though only jaguars will really hunt the large animals. The yakare caiman is the oldest of the two, estimated to have first appeared around 11 million years ago. Male yakares tend to reach around 6.5 to 10 feet, around 2 to 3 meters, and I haven't been able to find any official records larger than that. Like many caimans, they have the iconic patterning, almost like ink splotches. While fish and snails make up most of their diet, especially among young individuals, larger animals have been known to kill mammals such as capybara. Like many crocodile species, these guys for a long time were under tremendous threat and pressure. Millions were killed in an incredibly short span of time, mostly in the 80s, and in 1992 a ban was placed to protect them. However, today they have bounced back significantly, much like the alligator. It is once again legal to hunt them, but is extremely regulated to prevent another such disaster. One big reason it has bounced back is the fact that unlike many other croc species, they can reproduce fairly quickly. Spectacled caimans are incredibly similar to the yakares, but are notably smaller on average. Spectacles average between 6.5 to 8 feet, around 2 to 2.5 meters, and fewer of them get to that large size. It also shares a spotted and blotchy pattern across its body, though in colder months this is harder to see. These animals get darker in color when the temperatures go down, likely to increase the amount of sunlight they can absorb. The name spectacled caiman comes from a bony ridge between its eyes, which almost gives it the appearance of wearing glasses. These animals can be found all across the northern parts of South America and has the largest range of any caiman. It is also one of the only invasive caimans, with invasive populations established in Florida and Cuba. While it's unlikely that they'd be able to survive much farther north, they've become a threat in the places they are established and have outcompeted animals like the Cuban crocodile and pose a serious threat to those native species. Part of their success is the fact that they can be generalist predators and will not stick to aquatic prey as much as the yakare caiman, broadening their spectrum and allowing them to adapt, though they seem to prefer aquatic prey more overall. They faced hunting pressure too, but stories of other caiman species saved most of these animals. Despite millions of these animals being hunted since the 1980s, populations remained fairly stable as protections for animals like the Yacare caiman extended to them as well. However, some notable subspecies of this animal have been hunted to near extinction, such as the Rio Apaporis caiman and the groups in Colombia. Overall, this genus is doing incredibly well, despite some of their species being rare or absent entirely. They are abundant across South America, and as long as they remain protected, I don't think that'll change anytime soon. Which brings us to our last two caimans, though they seem to have evolved separately from one another. The first of these, since we are going by most primitive, is the broad-snouted caiman, first appearing around 9 billion years ago. As their name implies, unlike many other caimans, they have a short and broad snout comparable to that of an alligator, but even more extreme. They are larger on average than their cousins, reaching around 2 to 3.5 meters, up to 11 feet long. Like many caimans, they have an overall generalist diet, but will mainly go after tougher prey like turtles. Their broad snouts are better adapted at crushing than their relatives, but that also allows them to adapt to another food source. In recent years, studies have been published suggesting broad-snouted caimans are omnivores rather than strictly carnivorous. They were seen eating fruit in captivity, and this led us to discovering they also do it in the wild. It has been suggested that they are an important method of seed dispersal across their home range, and fruit may make up a large portion of their diet. Hunting of broad-snouted caimans began much earlier than others because while they do have osteoderms, their skin is far smoother and less rough than their relatives. This made them extremely threatened from the 1940s onwards until regulations were placed to prevent them from being overhunted. While their populations have somewhat recovered, they are still endangered as a whole, but hopefully, like the other caimans, they can recover quickly. And last, but certainly not least, we reach the largest caiman genus still alive today, the black caiman. There are two known species, but one of them is extinct. This animal is generally considered the largest alligator alive, even larger than the American alligator. Male black caimans have a slightly larger range on their sizes, reaching about 11.5 to 16.5 feet, around 3.5 to 5 meters. There have, of course, been claims of even larger caimans exceeding 6 meters or 20 feet in length. However, like alligators, there have been no confirmed specimens of this size. Despite that, it seems many scientists generally agree that these caimans can reach up to that size. Whether or not it's true still kind of remains to be seen. They have an overall generalist diet, and smaller individuals are particularly fond of fish. Larger caimans, of course, tend to hunt larger prey and will more commonly take large mammals, even African river dolphins on occasion. Large adults regularly prey upon capybara. Their names are actually accurate as well, as unlike many caimans, they have a much darker coloration. They also have proportionally larger head and eyes and are overall bulkier than the other caimans. This bulk gives them a significant advantage when hunting, much like other crocs, as it allows them to take on far larger prey and also offers them a bit of protection. Adult males are rarely killed by the predators of smaller caimans like jaguars and anacondas. Smaller individuals, of course, can and are still taken by predators, but like other large crocs, adult males have almost no natural predators. Even the infamous and mighty jaguar will rarely attack a large black caiman, and large caimans are also capable of hunting these jaguars as well, though the cats notably stay away from ponds that they've seen especially large caimans at. Jaguars, based on what we can tell, are capable of carrying animals up to 700 pounds, around 320 kilograms of weight. Especially large males would almost certainly be too much for a jaguar, as they exceed up to 1,100 pounds, around 500 kilograms. This makes the black caiman one of the dominant predators of its range, but unfortunately they aren't doing as well as some of the others. Between the 1950s and 70s, they were hunted to the point that they became endangered, and once again protections had to be put in place on this species in the hopes of restoring them. While hunting limitations has helped them a bit, habitat loss has hindered their recovery. Despite their powerful build and size, they are slower to reproduce than other caiman species and have had a difficult time recovering due to their niche being filled by the overabundance of spectacled caiman. Spectacled caimans compete directly with juvenile black caimans for aquatic prey, and this competition has kept black caiman numbers far lower than normal. While not classified as endangered any longer, they are considered conservation dependent and still require human help wherever they can. Part of the issue with helping these animals is the public's perception of them. Many people are driven by fear of these animals because they are so large and powerful that they can in fact hunt humans, much like alligators and crocodiles. While I can understand this fear, hopefully folks can overcome their fear once they learn about the animals. They are magnificent creatures, all of them, and they deserve our respect and kindness, even if they can be fearsome predators. And so ends the alligatoroids, and brings us to the last major group of animals, the longirostries. This includes the animals we all know and love, crocodiles, and the brilliant group of animals known as ghariales. But as I'm sure you've guessed, there is far more to it than that. These animals can be split into two major groups, the Crocodiloidea and the Gavialoidea. We'll start with the less popular but still very impressive Gavialoidea. These animals first appeared around 70 million years ago and diverged along a path much different from the rest of their kin, with long and pointed snouts. These animals are fairly large and their teeth are long and thin compared to the rest of their family. Though many of you may note from earlier in this video and previous videos that many different pseudosuchians evolved a thinner and longer snout, showing us that this has been a tried and true tactic for the family. The most primitive and earlier forms of these animals, such as Megadontosuchus, still maintained a lot of basal crocodilian features, and its skull and teeth were far more robust than most gavialids known. Their jaws were wider towards the rear, and not as specialized for fish as its later relatives would be. It was once thought that an even more ancient animal, Thoracosaurus, was a gavialid. However, more recent analysis has suggested that they are in fact not true crocs and are rather eusuchians. Either way, this would eventually lead to the Gavialidae, which would further split into two groups again. One of these is the Tomistomini, a group that is only represented today by one living species, the false ghariale. Originally, these animals were thought to be closer related to crocodiles than true ghariales, based entirely on fossil and bone evidence. It wasn't until molecular studies of these animals in 2018 that we learned that they were in fact gavialids and thus closer to true ghariales. The extinct Tomistomini have a complicated history, and there are many debates surrounding them, making many of them hard to classify. They are all relatively large animals, with the living species, the false ghariale, reaching up to 5 meters or 16 feet for large males. They have an incredibly slender and long skull, with only true ghariales having thinner snouts. Traditionally, we viewed these guys as being mainly fish eaters, piscivores, but more recent studies have shown us that they are actually generalist predators, despite their thin snouts. They're known to prey on monkeys, birds, and even deer across their native range, which are places like Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and Malaysia. Because of their remote location, there is still much to learn about the wild habits of these animals, including what season they reproduce. Unfortunately, they are listed as vulnerable, mainly due to habitat loss as the swamplands and surrounding forests are being destroyed. Alongside that, the species is often hunted in large numbers, hindering their chances of recovery. There is only thought to be around 10,000 of these animals left in the wild. Like many of the animals we will discuss, it is us humans who are the biggest threat to them. Moving on to the Gavialinae, which includes the true ghariales, these are the crocs with the thinnest snouts of all their family. These animals first started appearing around 20 million years ago in the fossil record, though they may be older than that. Many primitive forms like Penghusuchus and Hanyusuchus had thin snouts to be sure, but not nearly so thin as their living relatives. These extinct forms were thought to be relatively large as well, with Hanyusuchus thought to reach around 6 meters or 20 feet in length. We'll talk more about them a little bit later. In the following time, around 15 million years ago, is when we see the snouts of these animals begin to taper more, becoming thinner and straighter, with interlocking pointed teeth for grasping fish, and many gavialoids began to take to the seas rather than fresh water. This is exemplified in animals like Piscogavialis, a large 25-foot or 7.5 meter long seafaring gavialid. They were thought to have been fast hunters, chasing down equally fast fish. This was thought to be a coastal species, coming onto the beaches when they weren't hunting or traveling. They also shared territory with another gavialid, Sakakosuchus, which was a much smaller generalist predator. They were thought to reach around 14 feet, 4.3 meters, so they're still large animals, relatively speaking. The group continued this trend of marine habits as it proved successful for them. It is thought that here is where the modern ghariales attained their specialized snout. One in particular stood out, the enormous Gryposuchus. Now, there are several species of Gryposuchus, but one recently discovered species, G. croizati, was estimated to reach up to 33 feet or 10 meters in length. This would put them in the race for the largest of the gavialoids ever. That being said, Gryposuchus was one of the most successful of these early gavialids, represented by multiple species in both marine and freshwater environments. This would also put them in contact with Purosaurus on occasion, which may have hunted them as well. This family of animals would lose their massive size over time, like the other crocodilians, due to the shifts in their environment. The formation of the Amazon basin rerouted much of the fresh water to the ocean rather than the warmer coastal waters of the Caribbean. This would force them to adapt and resulted in many of the giant species going extinct. However, over in Asia, there was another contender among the large gavialoids, which would be Ramphasuchus, a giant Asian gavialid. Originally, it was thought to be an absolutely monstrous size, with wild estimates placing them at 18 meters, nearly 60 feet long. However, those size estimates have long since been debunked, and nowadays it's thought that they would be around 33 feet or 10 meters in length, which is still a massive animal in retrospect. Between them and Gryposuchus, currently Ramphasuchus is thought to be the heavier animal, weighing up to 3 tons at its heaviest estimates. In contrast, Gryposuchus is thought to top out just shy of 2 tons themselves. However, these estimates should also be taken with a grain of salt, as Ramphasuchus is only known from fragmentary material on the snout and skull. Ramphasuchus is a relatively young species as well, first appearing around 5 million years ago and disappearing around 2 million years ago. They are thought to be a more generalized animal as well. This brings us to the true gharials, and for this I've brought on a friend to talk about them. Some of you may know him from TikTok from his popular shorts, but this is Forever NPC. He makes a lot of cool content about prehistoric animals, museums, and donuts. He owns a donut shop. He doesn't just make content about donuts. Make sure to take a look-see at his content, which I'll link down below, but for now, go ahead and take us away, Tyson.
Well, I suppose it's my turn. Let's talk about gavials. So let's talk about the crocodilian family, Gavialidae. Currently, there are 2 living species. First, you have the gharials of South Asia. Scientific name, Gavialis gangeticus. The other species of this family are the false gharials of Southeast Asia. Scientific name, Tomastoma schlageli. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is the difference between these two? They look the same. For that, we have to look at their skulls. In general, members of this family have long, narrow snouts compared to their other crocodilian counterparts. But in the case of these two, the main distinction is the base of their skull, where in false gharials, or tomastoma, their base is a little bit more triangular and eventually narrows out. And in the case of the true gharials, or Gavialis, their snouts kind of just shoot out from an abrupt change from the base of their skull. Differences aside, these two crocodilians have a lot in common. This family in general are specialized eaters. Due to their long, narrow snout, they're really good at catching fish. Because of the shape of their snout, they're able to whip their jaws with ease underwater quickly to catch their prey. These guys were built for the water. Of all the crocodilians today, these guys spend more time in the water than any other crocodile. They're the fastest and most agile of all crocs. They're also not the smallest either, with some of these reaching about 20 feet or 6 meters long. However, as great as they are in the water, they are lackluster on land. Due to their shorter, stouter legs, they can't lift themselves up on land, but instead slide around and push themselves. Oh, also, while we have this pic, you might notice that bump at the end of their nose. That is called a bulla, and it's only present in males. And it has empty chambers in it so that it could resonate and attract females, basically creating its own little love song. Now, this family, Gavialidae, is a recently new family within the crocodiles, believing to evolve from the Indian subcontinent, with evidence leading them back to the Pliocene, about 2.6 million years ago. And one of the more notable extinct gavials is this guy, Han Suchus, the Chinese gharial. Who is named after this guy? Han Yu, a Tang Dynasty poet/official, who one day proclaimed that these crocodiles must leave the area or be killed. Well, with Han Suchus not respecting the authority of Han Yu, these gharials were, they were hunted to extinction. So there you go. A quick summary of gavials. Hopefully you learned something new and appreciate these most specialized of crocodilians.
I couldn't have said that last part better myself, Tyson, and make sure you guys go check out his content at his channel. Again, I'll make sure to leave that link down below. But his last note about Han Suchus brings me to an important note about gharials. At the start of the 20th century, there was thought to be thousands of gharials, and they were considered common animals among their native range. However, by the 80s, their population had been severely reduced, and they were no longer found through over 90% of their ancestral range. There was only thought to be around 200 left alive in the wild at the time. It was around this time, as other parts of the world had successful conservation programs, that conservation also began for the gharial. However, unlike many of the programs that were thought to be successful, the gharials has been far less. This is mainly in part to just how many different threats they face. Gill nets, which have become far more common for fishing in the area, have killed numerous gharials since their rise in popularity. Aside from this, various mining projects as well as dams, irrigation canals, and similar things have destroyed the gharials' territory and continues to do so today. The loss of habitat and ensnarement has hindered their recovery and forced them into smaller and smaller areas. They are listed as critically endangered, and there is only suspected to be around 900 or less of these animals still in the wild, with Nepal being one of the leaders of current conservation. Various conservation efforts worldwide have begun to crack down harder on their recovery, but it's still been incredibly slow. Recently, they were sighted in Pakistan for the first time in over 30 years, and thankfully there has been efforts to increase conservation in Pakistan. In other words, they want the population there to not only survive, but thrive and to re-establish a solid wild population in the country. Hopefully, more efforts like this are taken and the species can make a proper recovery throughout their entire range. As Tyson was mentioning, Hanyu destroyed an entire species of gharial, so let's not follow in his footsteps and help keep these animals around for more. They, along with the false gharial, are the only remaining members of a unique and ancient lineage. Brilliant and beautiful animals, they are amazing creatures, and like so many others, they deserve our respect and love. Hopefully we can make sure that they pull through, and this finally leads us to the last of these animals and the most well-recognized groups of them all, the crocodiles. Crocodiloidea, the most infamous of this group overall, can be divided into two major groups, the Crocodilidae and the Mekosuchini. The Mekosuchini, which is the lesser known of the two, has a complicated history and their exact placement is unknown. While we do know they belong to a family that includes true crocodiles, they have been previously claimed separate under their own lineage from either the alligators, crocodiles, or gharials. They have also been embedded within the true crocodiles themselves, not far related from salties or similar. However, other studies, including one more recent one, shows that they very well might be crocodiloids and a sister group to the modern crocodile lineage rather than completely separate or completely embedded. The Mekosuchini are known exclusively from Australia and its surrounding islands and are an extremely old lineage, thought to have first arisen around 56 million years ago. Some species survived until more recently and may have even had contact with humanity. They are incredibly diverse and appear to have taken on a multitude of different lifestyles, from walking on land to the standard aquatic lifestyle and even the possibility of arboreal species. The earliest of these animals is called Kambara, which, like many early members of this group, maintained a relatively similar build and likely lifestyle to modern crocodilians, being semi-aquatic ambush predators. There has been suggestions they may have been better adapted to walking on land, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were land crocs, as the rest of their build seems better suited to an aquatic life. It seems that these adaptations may have been for walking along the bottom of water bodies, which may have led to the terrestrial crocs we will talk about in a moment. There are 4 known species of Kambara, and 2 are thought to have possibly lived together, though I will say that they may not have actually interacted and were only forced together due to hard times. It is unclear exactly how the niche partitioning would have taken place, if it did at all. They were not the largest animals, being around 11 feet or 3.5 meters long, but still pretty big. Overall, they seem to have a relatively powerful bite force, designed for crushing prey and holding it in a powerful grip, and in one of the last species, it was thought that they developed a further adaptation to grasp large prey before crushing it with their jaws. Moving further along the line of these animals brings us to generalists like Australosuchus and Baru, with the former being notable as being a southern croc in Australia. Australosuchus seems completely separate from the other croc genuses present at the time, such as Baru, and it was thought that this was because they were better adapted to the colder climates of southern Australia during this time period. How or why it was able to survive and last in that cold environment is still unknown, but it seems Australosuchus was far better suited to the cold than its neighbors. Baru, on the other hand, was a northern animal and the largest predator of its ecosystem. While it is generally thought that they would have been ambush predators, their hunting would have been a little different. At 13 feet, around 4 meters long, they were the apex of their ecosystem, but were also an incredibly robust croc. It was thought that they may have even grown larger, but no evidence has come forward to support this. Its skull is so robust that it earned them the nickname the cleaver-headed crocodile. Like many Mekosuchines, they had backwards curving teeth with sharp cutting edges, which differ from the conical teeth of modern crocs. These teeth, combined with powerful muscles in the head, would have allowed these animals an insanely powerful bite, designed not to hold, but to slice and rip through the animal's vital areas. This is where it gets the name cleaver. With one powerful blow, they tear through an animal. This would rapidly take down even large prey, making them well suited to hunt Australia's megafauna of the time. Another large and robust Mekosuchine, Paludirix, appeared later on. Following Baru's trend, they were powerful animals and larger than their predecessor. Paludyrix is thought to have reached 16 feet on average, around 5 meters, with larger animals possibly reaching 6 meters or more. This is about the same as the modern saltwater croc. Much of the early crocodile fossil material from Australia was often assigned to the now dubious species Palomnarchus. Paludyrix was among the material that was assigned to them at the time, and it wasn't until 2020 that it was assigned to its own genus. However, unlike Baru, Paludyrix had conical teeth that was standard in crocodilians, with an overbite similar to that of an alligator. Paludyrix would have shared territory with other mesosuchian crocodiles as well as the modern-day freshwater crocodile. While they may have had to compete with others of their kind, freshwater crocs occupy a different niche from the larger predators, allowing an easier coexistence. But undoubtedly, the most famous of the mesosuchini is Quincana. Alongside Paludyrix, Quincana was one of the last of the mesosuchini on the mainland of Australia. There are several different species of these animals and no clear indication of exactly what size it was. Current estimates have most of their fossils around 3 meters or 10 feet in length, but some undescribed specimens may have reached a whopping 6 meters. Its true size is difficult to verify due to the overall fragmentary nature of the remains, but we do have some decent material to learn from. Their teeth in particular stand out as they have what are known as zyphodont teeth. They are recurved like Baru and sharply serrated. It was thought that these teeth were designed to take down large prey, like the giant mammals that occupied Australia at the time. While many would expect them to follow the trend of the other mesosuchians, Quincana is speculated to have been a mainly terrestrial predator, though still capable of returning to water sources. This would have reduced competition between them and Paludyrix, but would have possibly brought them into competition with another predator, the Megalania. We aren't entirely sure if the two animals would have competed on a deep level like some modern animals do, but they did overlap in time and territory. They are both designed for two different methods of hunting, but may have targeted the same prey. We aren't entirely sure. The mainland mesosuchini lasted until around 10,000 years ago. It is speculated that as the global temperature shifted, cooling much of the planet, the territory that they lived in was changed drastically. It became much drier, and the freshwater, swampy habitats became less common. With these habitats gone, the modern crocodilians are thought to have survived by moving to coastal environments and may have outcompeted the mesosuchians that remained. The only survivors were the ones who had moved to island habitats. One such animal was Mecosuchus, the namesake of the family, and a curious little croc. Thought to be around 6.5 feet, they weren't particularly large animals, which wasn't needed for the island life. They originated on the mainland of Australia some 28 million years ago before spreading over the islands in the Coral Sea, including places like New Caledonia. As a result of their success, there were several different species, which had short, blunt snouts not unlike caimans, but some species it seemed even shorter, likely for crushing the shells of mollusks. One species, M. whitehunterensis, seemed to have teeth designed for shaking their heads side to side, much like young crocs do today. These crocs seemed to be terrestrial and aquatic at the same time, with adaptations to living on land as well, with slightly longer limbs for a more upright stance. That being said, they likely still spent a decent amount of time in and around water. One species, M. inexpectus, has even been suggested to be arboreal in the past. This means it may have been capable of living to an extent in the trees. Most scientists seem to consider this unlikely, and as such, there hasn't been much research released on the matter. However, I think it is worth noting that many crocodilians today seem to exhibit behavior where they do happen to climb trees from time to time, at least to a certain extent, so I wouldn't rule it out entirely. Either way, these were the last of the living mesosuchians, having gone extinct around 3,000 years ago. There has been suggestions that they were around as recently as 1,700 years ago, but this has not been confirmed as of yet, I believe. Mesosuchians are a brilliant group, fascinating in all the right ways, but now we come to the true crocodiles, the genus Crocodylus itself, as well as their direct relatives. This group is known as the Crocodilidae. The mainline crocodiles, as far as we know, arose around 46 million years ago. Around 40 million years ago, they split into two more groups, the Crocodylinae and the Osteolaminae. It was thought that both groups originated in Africa before spreading out towards other continents. The Osteolaminae can be defined by a fairly jarring split, with slender-nosed crocodiles on one end and more broad-nosed crocodiles on the other. This also includes several extinct animals, like Euthecodon, which has one of the most interesting skulls of any crocodilian, in my opinion. Euthecodon has a saw-like appearance when looked at from the top. The purpose for this was to separate the teeth, giving each its own bony sheath in the jaw. Euthecodon was also notable because it might be extremely large. Some estimates have placed this animal at up to 33 feet or 10 meters in length, with more reserved estimates maxing out around 28 feet or about 8.5 meters. It has to be noted that these measurements were based on Nile crocodiles, as there's not much material for this animal beyond the skull. This could potentially be a large error, as Nile crocodiles would likely have different proportions than the slender Broad-snouted genus. Their unique jaw structure allows these crocodiles to have a similar diet to gharials, so that might be a better comparison for size, but there's been no studies that have done so. In its time, Euthekodon would have also coexisted alongside one of its living relatives, the slender-snouted crocodile Mecistops, which contains 2 species. The slender-snouted crocodiles are different from their larger counterparts, however. Instead of focusing solely on fish, they have a more generalized diet, consisting of fish as well as smaller animals like birds. Males can reach up to around 4 meters, around 13 feet in length, though there have been estimates as high as 15 feet, around 4.5 meters. While certainly not the biggest nor most aggressive croc, these larger animals will take the opportunity to tackle bigger prey when the opportunity arises. Unfortunately, not much is known about these animals' behavior in the wild. As of 2014, they are critically endangered and cannot be found throughout much of their former range across West and Central Africa, and it's thought that fewer than 500 individuals remain in the wild today. However, conservation efforts have been underway, with Abidjan Zoo leading the charge with a breeding program that has already been introducing crocs to the wild once they reach around 4 years old. Because we lack any real knowledge about their wild habits, we have begun monitoring their populations more closely and hopefully helping these unique crocodiles survive. The last of the Osteolaminae, the dwarf crocodile, has faced some contention. Usually referred to as a singular species, there have been past proposals for another isolated in the Congo Basin. This, however, has not been proven in any capacity as of this moment. So for now, let's focus on this one known species, which may be itself splitting off into another. Dwarf crocodiles are the smallest crocodiles, though they are larger than the dwarf caiman we previously discussed. These animals reach a maximum of around 6.2 feet, just shy of 2 meters in length. Because of how small they are, much like some caimans, they are incredibly heavily armored, giving them a much thicker, broader appearance. Of course, this is to reduce predation, as their smaller size leaves them far more vulnerable. These animals also inhabit West Africa, like the slender-snouted croc. However, unlike other crocs, these animals veer off from the norm. They are rarely ever noted to be basking in the sun like other crocs, and their darker coloration may help them soak up more sunlight without basking. They prefer heavily forested areas or areas with a lot of shade and are most active at night. This may also be an adaptation to avoid predators that may be active in the day. This might also be why the alleged cave crocodiles have begun to emerge. In recent years, the Abanda caves found in Gabon, Africa, have been known to host a relatively small population of dwarf crocodiles. Studies have shown that these animals are an isolated genetic group, separating them slightly from their other relatives and setting them on their way to possibly becoming a new species. These animals live inside of these caves, which has slightly changed their coloration due to the water being filled with alkaline. These animals feed on the bats that inhabit the cave and may be getting their heat from an underground source. They live in near complete darkness and are incredibly remarkable. While the cave variety preys mainly on bats and larger insects because that's what's within the cave, the standard dwarf croc are opportunistic and will realistically eat anything alive small enough to fit in their mouths and then some. Like the other small animals, these guys are adept at making burrows for themselves to hide in. Their reclusive and solitary nature has made it somewhat difficult to determine their populations over the years. Like the heavily armored South American caimans, dwarf crocodiles are not widely hunted for leather because their skin makes for poor quality, which is a win for the crocs if you ask me. However, they are sometimes hunted for meat. However, their main threat is the loss of habitat. In certain areas like Gambia, the species is all but extinct. However, many places in Africa still hold a solid population for now. These guys are currently listed as vulnerable, and they certainly are if we keep destroying their habitat. Thankfully, this animal is widely kept in zoos across the world, so a complete extinction may not be likely for now, but a wild extinction would still be devastating. And finally, we come to the Crocodylinae, the mainline crocodiles and the ones that we all know and love, including the genus Crocodylus and all of its direct relatives. One of the first true crocodiles in Asia, Crocodylus paleoindicus, was once thought to be a direct ancestor to mugger crocodiles. This has somewhat been contested by other studies, but still remains a possibility due to distinct similarities between the two animals. Many of the early animals may have been even larger than modern crocodiles, with some estimates for animals like C. anthropophagus and C. thorbjarnarsoni reaching up to 25 feet over 7.5 meters long. There is also evidence that some of these crocodilians would have preyed upon humans, and they were equipped very similarly to modern crocs to do so. C. thorbjarnarsoni was particularly notable for being a crocodile with a relatively broad snout, not usually seen in crocs. These were likely ancestral to many of the African crocodile species that would begin to arise and could be found today across the world. Here they are split into two lineages, quote unquote, but still remain as one cohesive family. The lineages are the African and New World lineage and the Asian and Australian lineage. Both of these lines originated in Africa, but some left and evolved separately due to different pressures on their respective continents. It was thought that these groups diverged 12 to 13 million years ago, with the freshwater crocodile being one of the first to appear. Just to let you know, I'm going to refer to the first one as the ANW lineage and the second one as the AA lineage. Starting with the ANW, they can of course be further split into the African and American lines. These lines also contain two extinct species, Crocodylus falconensis and Crocodylus chechii. Both of these species contain extreme similarities to one another, including a bony protrusion along their skulls, sometimes known as a boss, like in the dinosaur Pachyrhinosaurus. While it certainly doesn't share the same function as the dinosaurs variation, these bosses are only found today in the neotropical species of crocodiles in the Americas. Furthermore, while C. falconensis was found in Venezuela, South America, C. chechii was found in Tanzania, Kenya, and Libya in Africa. It is currently thought that the two are sister taxons and may possibly represent multiple crocodile lineage that would expand towards the Americas. The two living representatives of crocodiles in Africa are one well-known and one lesser-known animal. The lesser-known is the West African crocodile, and the more widely known is the Nile crocodile. Of course, the West African croc seems to often be mistaken for their more aggressive cousin, but they don't quite get as large. Despite this mistake, they are actually not closely related to any living crocodiles, with their closest known relatives being extinct species. West African crocs are an incredibly basal among the ANW lineage. They are also smaller than the Nile crocs, with large males reaching around 10 feet, just over 3 meters on average. Exceptional individuals have been reported up to 13 feet, around 4 meters, but this still makes them relatively small, but certainly not the smallest. They are of course still formidable predators. Their heads are fairly short, but like many crocodiles, it is also robust and powerful. Unfortunately, not much is known about the differences between this animal and the Nile crocodile due to the species only being more broadly recognized since 2011. We have, however, learned that this crocodile is sometimes worshipped. These crocodiles have adapted to the dry season incredibly well, enough so that some populations can be found in parts of the Sahara Desert. They will undergo aestivation, burrowing in the sand during the driest periods and remaining dormant until the rains return. This has led to the nickname the sand crocodile. The Mauritanian people of the area revere these crocodiles. They believe that the crocs are essential to the water, and without them the water would not return after the dry season. Because of that, these animals are heavily protected in these areas. Allegedly, in Mauritania, the animal coexists peacefully with humans and they don't attack swimmers. But worship of these animals goes even further. In ancient Egypt, these animals were often worshipped due to the belief that they were connected to Sobek, one of their gods who bore the visage of a crocodile. Because they were more docile and easier to handle than the Nile crocodile, they are more commonly found throughout Egyptian archaeological sites. They were given places of honor and were embedded in the society, and it was even said that some were kept as pets. Allegedly, in Sobek's temple, they would have a crocodile living in the pool that was worshipped, adorned with jewels and gold, and fed lavish meals. These crocodiles, as well as others of honors, have been found mummified in their own sarcophagi, laid to rest just as a person would. Due to how recently they have been recognized as a species, their population numbers are still up in the air, and I couldn't find any good information on it. Though, with how revered and cared for these animals are and how widespread their range is, I am hopeful that these animals are safe for now. Now, their counterpart is another story entirely. One of the most famous crocodiles worldwide is Gustav, and he belongs to this species, the Nile crocodiles. This is a relatively old group, emerging around 11 million years ago and spreading across much of modern-day Africa. They are absolutely massive animals and the second largest living crocodilian. Average sizes differ by region, as some environments are much better than others. Based on estimates I've seen, it seems average size goes between 10 to 15 feet for large males, around 3 to 4.5 meters long. However, unlike many other crocodilians, exceptional specimens have been recorded over the years for the Nile croc. While Gustav is often speculated to be the largest Nile crocodile, and I personally believe he might be, we don't know for sure as he has never been captured and measured in any official capacity. The largest confirmed Nile crocodile was still incredibly massive, reaching nearly 6.5 meters, around 21 feet, and weighing 2,400 pounds, more than a ton. Other exceptional animals have been seen over the years, though larger individuals are less common as human expansion continues. Like all crocodiles, aside from gharials and the slender-snouted variation, these animals have an exceptionally powerful bite force, and when combined with their large size makes them one of the top predators in their ecosystem. No animal is safe at the water's edge because of these animals, and they are incredibly aggressive even by crocodile standards. This aggression has led to a sort of pecking order to reduce competition between themselves, since many individuals inhabit inhabit territory together. The largest males get to eat first, get first access to girls, and get the best basking spots. They are found in all sorts of habitats, even in brackish water. While biologically they are able to tolerate salt water, they seem to prefer to stay in freshwater habitats as much as possible. Because of their tolerance of habitats, they can be found in many places of Africa and even in some parts of Madagascar. We haven't really mentioned it yet, so let's talk about basking in crocodiles real quick. It is known that basking is used as a way for these animals to regulate their body temperature. Laying in the sun allows them to raise their temp higher and allowing them better performance. However, on particularly hot days, they can also open their mouths to expel heat when basking, allowing themselves to reach a good temperature without burning up too much. Because of course, too much heat can kill crocodiles if they don't regulate their temperature enough. Like the West African crocodiles, in the drier parts of their territory, Nile crocodiles will also undergo aestivation. They create burrows, entering a state of semi-dormancy while they wait for the water to return. Of course, they are remarkably adaptable. Nile crocodiles are opportunistic predators and can go for many months without eating. Sometimes they will wait whole seasons in certain areas for their prey to return before hunting again. Females, like in most crocodilian species, won't eat while they're guarding their nest. However, when they're on the hunt, nothing is safe. Larger animals can take almost anything that comes into the water, save for giant mammals like hippos and elephants. Wildebeest, zebras, and various antelope all seem to be common prey. They've even been seen using their tails to unbalance animals, making it easier to grab them and drag them back into the water. They can also be cooperative to an extent. Smaller animals will take a variety of food and have even been seen driving fish to the shoreline to make easier pickings, working together to trap them. When hunting larger prey and sharing a meal, they will use each other as leverage to rip chunks from their prey, allowing the larger individuals to eat first while waiting their turn. Fighting is a common occurrence at these feeding sites, so cooperation is extremely limited. But one of the most shocking and frightening things about these animals is that despite being best adapted and unmatched in the water, they will occasionally hunt on land. Individuals have been noted to hide along game trails in thick brush, relying on wild and unpredictable ambush attacks. They will never stray too far from the water's edge, but far enough that one would not be expecting it. During leaner times, this will occasionally bring them into conflict with mammalian predators like lions and hyenas. Such conflicts rarely end in bloodshed, as a dominant party is usually quickly established. Bigger crocodiles have been noted to go after these mammal predators, and a large enough group have been known to hunt the crocodiles as well. The winner is usually determined by the setting, and it is rarely set in stone. Most of the time, these predators avoid each other for this exact reason. Nile crocodiles, unfortunately, have an incredibly complicated history. In the 1940s, hunting these animals for leather became incredibly common, and a market for their meat had already been established by locals, but the locals had been sustainably hunting these crocs for generations. However, from the 40s onwards, things began to look grim. Crocs were taken in massive numbers, and like the American alligator, they faced extinction by the 60s. Because of this, protections went up in several places all over Africa, but poaching and destruction of their habitat hindered their recovery in many places. Part of the reason for this is simply their proximity to humanity. They live in direct contact with humans throughout much of their range and will not shy away from hunting us as well. This has earned them a reputation as man-eaters and the animosity of the locals and some people worldwide. Because of the danger, many people don't want to stop hunting them and would rather they either go away or become extinct, and I don't blame people for that, because how would you feel if you'd lost someone to a croc yourself? That being said, I am never a proponent of wiping out a species simply because we fear it. Technology advances all the time, and it will get easier to find ways to coexist as time goes on. Wiping out the animals is not the solution, and that being said, many scientists have stated that with proper precautions, there was hardly ever any real danger from them in the first place. Regardless, this has caused difficulty in their recovery as the years have gone on in certain areas, especially in West and Central Africa. In these areas, pollution has also been a major cause of their decline as well, forcing them to find new territory or die. But certainly today, their greatest threat in these areas is poaching and unlawful hunting, as with much of Africa. However, in Eastern and Southern Africa, these animals have made an astonishing recovery thanks to regulations still in place today that reduce some of the killing. Because of this recovery as a whole, the species is not endangered today. Efforts are still underway, thankfully, to repatriate the species across their entire range. Nile crocodiles are one of the most fearsome modern representatives of crocs and are a brilliant and terrifying species. They are truly amazing, even if we fear them. That brings us to the American line of crocodiles that inhabit the neotropics and parts of the Americas. These are all living animals, represented by the Cuban, Morelettes, Orinoco, and American crocodiles. The Cuban and Morelettes are closer related to each other, and the same is true for the American and Orinoco. Morelette's crocodile, also known as the Mexican crocodile, is a modestly sized species, as are most of the American species. Average large sizes for males place them at around 8 feet 10 inches, around 2.7 meters long. Today, exceptionally large males have been noted to reach 10 feet or 3 meters in length, though there are records in the past of even larger animals reaching between 13 to 15 feet or 4 to 4.5 meters. These are rather robust crocs at that size and have exceptionally powerful muscles in their legs, which is a trait they share with the Cuban crocodile. This allows these animals to have explosive bursts of energy, even on land. These animals, like most crocs, are generalists, feeding on a variety of smaller animals. Larger animals, of course, take larger prey, which may even include other crocodilians like caiman or even other crocs. They have even been noted to take large prey like capybara or cattle as well, though large prey like that is incredibly uncommon for these animals, as exceptionally large crocs are rare. Aside from these few rare giants, these crocs must face competition from other crocodilians as well as jaguars who will hunt them at their smaller size and even at their relatively large sizes. They can be found throughout Central America and have even been seen as far north as the Rio Grande. During the 40s and 50s, these animals were targeted by hunters and poachers for their skin, leading to drastic decreases in population. Like many other species, efforts began to save them following this, and they had a middle-of-the-road recovery. In the more northern extents of their range, like Mexico and Belize, they are thriving once more and are considered least concerned in these areas. However, they are much rarer in places they were formerly common, and work still needs to be done to bring these animals back to the fold. But their story is not so desperate as their closest relative, the Cuban crocodile. Naturally, Cuban crocodiles are of course native to Cuba. While not the largest of crocs, Cuban crocs have a reputation due to a few characteristics. They are mid-sized on terms of crocodiles, with the largest males reaching up to 11 feet 3.5 meters, though on average they reach around 9 feet 2.75 meters. Their most notable characteristic is their rather long legs. While they do live in and around water sources, this species is well adapted to terrestrial life. Its legs are not only longer, but its front pair lack the webbing between the toes that are commonly found in crocs, and have reduced webbing on their rear feet as well. While most crocs are capable of a high walk and some can even run or gallop, I know, terrifying, Cuban crocs take this to a whole new level. They can run at up to speeds of 22 miles per hour, faster than most people, though they seem to average at around 15 miles per hour. While they can keep this up longer than their cousins, they still can only do so for a relatively short period of time compared to mammals. I'm unsure if they hunt this way. Most studies I've seen seem to show that they mainly still hunt from the water, feeding on a variety of prey. That being said, it wouldn't surprise me if they use their running to quickly close the distance on unsuspecting prey, or to get themselves out of harm's way, dodging what they might consider a predator. It's us, by the way. We're their most common predator, but we'll get to that in a second. Another interesting thing about this animal is its brain. Most crocodiles we have found exhibit a higher level of intelligence than most would usually expect. They can be taught basic commands in captivity, including food cues, to make the staff safer in enclosures. However, the Cuban croc takes this even further. They have been observed displaying, well, play-like behavior. Some have been seen playing with flower petals, pushing them around in the water and carrying them on the tips of their nose. Others were noted for letting other crocs ride around on their backs through the water. In an experiment, they preferred colored cinder blocks to their standard ones and would take the colorful ones back to the water. Aside from playful behavior, they are also known to work cooperatively. Whether this behavior is exhibited in the wild is unknown, but workers at Gatorland observed that the crocs coordinated attacks against them whenever they entered the enclosure, working together to attack their keepers from different angles, reminiscent of the raptors from Jurassic Park. This behavior has been reported for this group in multiple instances. It is thought that this intelligence is what makes them aggressive and territorial. This species is actually one of the most aggressive croc species, perhaps only behind its two largest cousins, and certainly the most aggressive in the Americas. Due to their aggression and capability to walk on land, many people fear this animal and want them gone. And again, while I understand that, fear is not a good reason to allow an animal to fade into extinction. There are almost never good reasons for it, especially when we are the cause. Cuban crocs are one of the most endangered species of crocs alive today, day, with less than 4,000 thought to remain. They face numerous threats, but mainly from humans. In the past, these animals could be found in Cuba and the islands of the Caribbean, and likely along the coastal areas as well. Humans have basically wiped them out from nearly everywhere, extensively hunting them for their meat and skins. Because of this, they are no longer present in the Caribbean and are now restricted to just Cuba, and even there they face major threats. Outside of poaching, which still remains a significant threat to this day, they have lost a significant amount of territory to human industrialization. Another threat they face is competition. Spectacled caimans have encroached on their territory, and they reproduce much faster than Cuban crocodiles. Despite the crocodile's supremacy in physical confrontation, they are slowly being driven out by the caiman's resilience and their faster breeding. And on top of all that, they face the threat of genetic extinction. The American crocodile, which has a wider range, has hybridized with Cuban crocs on some occasions. This hurts the genetics of the actual species. If it's too widespread, this could cause their genetic extinction. This is the same problem Scottish wildcats currently face due to people being irresponsible cat owners and letting their cats outdoors, except this problem is not directly caused by humans, unlike with the cats. Breeding programs across Europe, the US, and South America are all currently underway to try and save this species, and I will hold out hope that they can manage to. We can do our part and make sure that these animals are safe in the wild as best we can. Our next two species are closer related to each other, just as the last two were. Here we have the Orinoco and American crocodile. Unlike with the others, the confusion for these two is actually completely understandable. They have a very similar body plan overall, as well as being the overall largest crocodilians in their environment, rivaled only by the black caiman, but few caiman can attain the sizes of these crocs. American crocodiles are by far the most widespread crocodile species in the neotropics and surrounding areas, with populations present even as far north as the United States and Florida. But don't worry, these animals are not likely to move much farther north than Tampa Bay, as they are not as tolerant of the cold as alligators and can't survive very far north. In the past, American crocodiles actually used to be plentiful in Florida, but more on that later. These crocs tend to stick to salt or brackish water, mainly living in coastal areas, and are more rare inland. Aside from saltwater crocs themselves, American crocodiles are the most common in saltwater ecosystems, and they thrive there. While generally accepted as one of the largest crocodilians in its territory, precise sizes can be difficult to verify with this species due to the way crocodilians grow. Once they attain a certain age, depending on the resources available to them, they begin to bulk and put on weight rather than length, growing substantially in strength and power. The average for these guys ranges between 3 to 4 meters, about 10 to 13 feet. However, it seems that they can attain truly massive sizes. In the United States, the largest one found was a whopping 15 feet, around 4.5 meters long. There are larger, unverified reports from South America, alleging a massive size of up to 23 feet or 7 meters long. However, as I said, there are no verified reports of this animal reaching that size, and therefore we cannot say for certain. A big issue is human hunting may have taken a lot of the larger genes out of the pool. Today, it seems generally accepted, however, that they can reach sizes of around 19.8 feet, about 6 meters, though this is an incredibly rare and unseen occurrence. When young, these animals prefer smaller prey like fish and birds as they have a narrow snout. However, unlike the fish specialists like gharials, they have a more generalized approach to feeding. As they get older and bulkier, their prey changes with them and allows them to take on much bigger animals like cattle. Despite their ability to take on larger prey, these crocodiles are relatively docile compared to even alligators. Thanks to niche partitioning, they don't usually come into conflict with alligators. They do, however, have conflict with the spectacled caimans. They will eat caimans, but the caimans reproduce much faster. In areas where the crocs have been heavily hunted, the caiman has moved in and made it difficult for the crocs to recover. Conversely, areas where the croc is dominant hold low numbers of caiman. Because of this, they are in conflict fairly often. Like so many others, these crocs were overhunted in the past. It wasn't until 1972 that laws were set in place that protected these animals and began to help them recover. But as of right now, those laws haven't completely gotten them out of the woods. They were nearly wiped out in Florida, so much so that many people believe that alligators were Florida's only native crocodilian species. It's only been a more recent thing that they've begun to return, a sign that they are recovering and that some areas are still habitable, which is a huge win. In places like Jamaica, where they had a decent population in recent years, they have been poached in high numbers with no real effort from the government to stop the killing. This has led to a drastic drop in their numbers. numbers. As I mentioned, in many places where they were driven to near extinction like Venezuela, the spectacled caiman or other similar animals have made it hard for them to recover. However, thankfully they are no longer considered endangered. Now they are considered vulnerable, so they're not completely out of the woods, but they're on the road to recovery. Finally, we reach the last of the neotropic crocs, the Orinoco crocodile, named after a river basin that goes through Colombia and Venezuela. Orinoco crocs can be easily distinguished from American crocs once they are adults. The adult American croc has a much bulkier head than an adult Orinoco, which maintains a narrower snout overall. This is because while it does hunt other animals, its main prey is fish, but not just any fish. These animals tend to tackle the large predatory fish, like catfish, rather than the ones humans more commonly eat. In the past, locals justified the killings of crocs by claiming that they were driving the fish population too low, a point that was later shown to be wrong. This is the same as in the United States with predators like wolves, who are often blamed for the destruction of deer populations even though they are not the cause. Wolves naturally manage the deer population and are often blamed for poor hunting season. This has led wolves to face similar prejudice to the Orinoco crocodile, blamed for doing what it naturally does in its natural habitat. In both cases, the animals were in the right. That being said, the crocs will still take other prey as well, especially large males, as they still remain far bulkier than females or younger counterparts. While all the crocs in the Americas are large, it is widely accepted that none are as large on average as the Orinoco crocodile, though many others that I've already mentioned come close. As I mentioned prior, a big issue faced by a lot of these animal sizes has been human hunting. Humans wiped out many of the larger animals, whether for trophies, skin, meat, or similar. Because of that, a lot of those genes of the giant animals were removed from their respective pools. This can be seen worldwide in many different animals, who rarely achieve the monstrous sizes alleged in the past. The same is true for the Orinoco. Average sizes place these guys at around 16 feet, 4.8 meters in length. The largest Orinoco known from modern times was 16 feet 9 inches, about 5.1 meters. However, historical record shows us a much larger animal. A specimen shot in 1800, over 200 years ago now, was reported to measure 22 feet 3 inches, around 6.8 meters in length. While this estimate is considered reliable, there has never been a specimen put forth to prove it, so some scientists don't consider it possible. Today, it is generally agreed that most Orinocos will not exceed 17 feet. Unfortunately, these animals are still under threats today. In the past, they were hunted to near extinction, closer than most other species. Their large size made them attractive targets, and they were extensively hunted for skin and meat. Like many others in the 70s, they were given protections, but they were already on the precipice of death. Their recovery has been slow and difficult because they face numerous issues. First, despite legal protections, they are still being poached, and nowadays hatchlings are being taken for the pet trade from the wild. This impacts their numbers even more. Like American crocodiles, they too face the issue with competition from spectacled caimans. Current estimates believe that there are only between 500 to 1,500 wild animals left. While there are conservation programs underway, many of them face other issues, further hindering the Orinoco's recovery. Many of these programs lack the proper resources to make a significant difference. I personally believe these conservation efforts should form a united front of some sort to bolster the chances of these animals. Now, that being said, I commend these efforts for taking place at all, despite how much difficulty they certainly have faced. Their biggest success has been in the Llanos region, which is part of both Colombia and Venezuela, and they are still releasing crocs there to this day. Hopefully they can educate the local population across South America and help these amazing animals survive. And that brings us back around to the AA crocodiles, the ones from Asia and Australia. These are also split into two groups just like before. However, these groups don't have any fancy names, so just know that one group includes the New Guinea, freshwater, and Philippines crocs, and the others contain the saltwater, mugger, and Siamese crocs. One of the most unique among these are the freshies, or freshwater crocodiles. These little guys are unique and one of my favorite crocs, honestly. They are a relatively small crocodilian, reaching average sizes of around 7.5 to 10 feet, about 2.3 to 3 meters in length, but they are significantly lighter than most other species at the same size, with males commonly weighing only around 150 pounds. Larger individuals can reach up to 13 feet or 4 meters have been recorded, but they are pretty rare. Size isn't what makes these guys effective survivors. Freshies are only found in Australia, and despite their name, they are also capable of living in salt water as well. They live alongside the world's largest living crocodile, the saltwater crocodile, and still manage manage to thrive despite the other's aggression. Instead of large prey, these animals will target smaller creatures, especially crustaceans and fish. They will often simply wait for fish or similar to swim within range before striking. They have been known to take larger prey too, like wombats, but this is a rare occurrence due to their size. It is speculated that they may also try to avoid taking larger prey to avoid competition and attention from their larger relatives. They focus on their variety of small prey and will even eat snakes and similar animals. Their unique skull morphology doesn't change much, being rather slender overall. These animals are specialized generalists, meaning that they can take a variety of prey without sacrificing the adaptations that allow them to evade their larger relatives, such as a higher tolerance to arid and dry conditions. They are also a relatively docile species and not prone to the aggression of other crocs. In fact, there are incredibly few cases of this species even attacking a human, and no fatalities have ever occurred. They have bitten people on occasion, but they're never serious injuries. They're feisty, but certainly not aggressive. Unlike many, these animals are not really targeted by the locals, and there are likely a few reasons. One nowadays is that Australians seem to be more educated on reptiles than most of the rest of the world, partially because they live alongside them and partially because many folks from Australia are open and trying to teach folks. Another reason is simply they aren't aggressive. Many people hunt crocodiles because they fear them and often believe that they are doing the right thing. Freshies don't have the man-eating reputation and are therefore thought to be less dangerous. That being said, while they don't directly face threats from us, we have caused them some issues. Our introduction of the cane toad has been disastrous for freshwater crocs. They cannot ingest this animal and they will die if they eat one. While salties are able to eat the cane toad, the freshies will simply die, like I said. Cane toads are one of Australia's biggest problems. The next crocodile, the New Guinea crocodile, is a relatively small and poorly understood species overall. Recently, this animal was divided in two, as it was shown that two distinct populations live in New Guinea. One population lives in the north and one in the south. These two groups were divided where the highlands of New Guinea rose, eventually leading to them becoming two unique animals, with their differences mainly in the skull and genetics. There are also slight differences in their armor pattern as well. Large males can reach up to 11 feet, around 3.5 meters long, and that goes for both of these species. They are not known to get much larger than this, and it's rare for them to achieve even these sizes. The northern population, Crocodylus novaeguinei, is found exclusively in New Guinea, while the other species, Crocodylus halley, can also be found in parts of Indonesia. While they are certainly capable of being in salt water, they seem to avoid it like many other crocodilians, only entering salted or brackish water in certain occasions. They are mainly nocturnal and feed almost exclusively at night. They don't seem to be picky eaters and are known to eat almost anything worthy of their size, though they are not thought to be particularly aggressive. In the past, this species also faced prejudice as well and was indeed hunted, though never to the degree that other species were. The northern animal was heavily hunted and almost driven to extinction until protections were placed on both it and the southern species. This managed to save a majority of these animals who were able to recover in relative peace. Today, there are thought to be thousands of these animals in the wild, with healthy populations across their known range. Good for them. The last in this group is the Philippine crocodile, which was thought to be a subspecies of the New Guinea crocodile until the late 80s. Because of that, we lacked a good amount of research for these animals, and not much was known about them exclusively until more solid research began in the 2000s. They are known by several names with the local people, like Buaya and Bukarat. They are relatively small crocodiles and tend to stick exclusively to fresh water, which has limited them somewhat, but more on that later. Adults rarely exceed 9 feet, around 2.8 meters, and even then it is uncommon for them to reach that size. The largest of these animals known was around 11 feet, 3.5 meters long. Those would be record sizes and are incredibly rare. Because of their smaller size, the Philippine croc has thicker armor, much like the dwarf crocs and caimans, as a better form of protection. These animals are actually extremely important to the freshwater systems of the Philippines. Their main source of prey is fish, and these animals seem to have a habit of targeting the less healthy and dying fish. This is not necessarily uncommon with predators, but usually not to the degree seen in Philippine crocodiles. Why they target the weaker fish so often is unknown, but it keeps the fish populations incredibly healthy by removing the diseases. Because they aren't picky eaters, they also balance the fish populations as well, making sure that no one species attains more dominance in the waterways. Because their population is so spread out over the various islands of the Philippines, many of these populations are currently isolated, which has unfortunately led to a lower genetic genetic pool. Traditionally, they were thought to be much more widespread, and their populations were more connected through the Visayas archipelago. Visayas is the centralmost part of the country, and the populations there used to allow contact between the more isolated populations. But, like so many others, these animals faced dire threats that have caused their population to decline immensely. Today, the Philippine crocodile is the most threatened crocodile in the world. Historically, the people of the Philippines both feared and worshipped crocodiles, seen as representatives of the spirits. The local people, prior to European colonization, had a sort of peace with the animals. They found that as long as you didn't bother them, for the most part, they left you alone. Being killed by a croc was considered an honorable death, but many also believed that a crocodile would only kill a person as punishment for breaking oaths or taboos. Today, these views seem to be less commonly held, and only in certain places are the crocs still revered and accepted by the locals. In many other places across the country, crocs are viewed as vermin that threaten livestock and children, even though the Philippines croc is not particularly aggressive. In the Philippines, crocs are often compared to corrupt government officials, which is where the name buwaya comes from. Because of this, locals often kill them. The species was not recognized until the late 80s, and by then they were already in major danger. In 92, there was thought to be less than 1,000 of these crocodiles left in the wild, and as of today, there are believed to be less than 100 adults. The locals view them as man-eaters, a case of mistaken identity with the saltwater crocodile, which also shares their territory. Today, these local killings are the biggest threat to these animals. However, in the past, a big reason for their rapid decline was the loss of habitat. Many regions in the Philippines, including Visayas, was turned into farmland or human settlements, driving the crocs out. Thankfully, as of 2001, killing a crocodile is now punishable by law, which has helped in minor areas. Many conservation efforts are underway to try and save these animals, but as of now, their fate looks grim. Hopefully, we can help people all across the world to understand these animals better and want to protect them, and hopefully they can make a comeback like a couple of their relatives. And now we come to the last of the crocs, the final trio. Let's start with the least known of these three, the Siamese crocodile. This is not a well-known species for most people. This largely is because not a ton of research has been conducted on these animals in the wild. Much of their lifestyle, habits, and general activities are an overall mystery to us. This is because not only have we not done many studies, but this animal is reclusive and somewhat shy. They happen to live in denser, hard-to-reach parts of the jungle, making it incredibly difficult to get in and study them properly. They aren't aggressive towards humans, however, and the only recorded attacks seem to have been in self-defense or defense of their nest. These animals are known to mainly inhabit freshwater systems in southern Asia. They can be found in Indonesia and Malaysia, but can also be found on the mainland in countries like Cambodia. While not much is known about them, they are a mid-sized croc from what we can tell, and males typically grow to a maximum of around 10 feet or 3 meters long, but there have been exceptional specimens. These ones reach up to around 13 feet or 4 meters. Like many of their relatives, they mainly seem to prey on fish at all sizes, but they've also been seen eating snakes and amphibians. Today, this species is also threatened and is still in major danger. Only around 600 of these animals are thought to live in the wild, and they are completely gone from a majority of their former range across southern Asia, part of why it's so difficult to study them. The main reason for this, of course, is humans taking the land for themselves and driving these animals out. The farming industry has heavily impacted them by not only taking their territory, but also by damaging the ecosystem further with toxic fertilizers and pesticides. The Vietnam War was also a factor in their decline, as the war ravaged a large portion of these animals' natural territory with explosives. In modern times, dams have begun damaging the remaining populations as well, and the biggest threat to these animals is actually farming. You see, there is a huge market in these countries for crocodile skins, meats, and products. Because of that, in the 40s, they were captured to an extreme degree, kickstarting a crocodile farming industry. Unfortunately, this market is still thriving today, which has led to people capturing wild crocodiles and selling them to these farms, despite legal protections now in place. There are an insane amount of farms for this species, and it is thought that there are 700,000 crocodiles alive on farms today. They're being sold for skin and meat rather than being used for recovering the wild populations. But hope is not entirely lost. Many efforts are underway to save these wild populations. Cambodia in particular is leading the charge in this, with the government working with local people to protect not only the remaining animals, but their habitat as well. Others are following suit, as maintaining a healthy habitat will help these animals recover naturally. Several breeding programs outside of those farms have begun as well, trying to slowly bolster the total number in the wild. Currently, Cambodia and Laos hold the largest known populations of Siamese crocodiles, and so much of the world's focus is on those two regions, of course, but others shouldn't be counted out. In Vietnam and Thailand, the species is considered extinct in the wild. However, in recent years, Vietnam managed to establish a small breeding population and plans to expand on that. Thailand also now has a significant amount of protected areas and has their own crocodile program. Their goal is to reintroduce these animals into the protected areas and hopefully bring back Thailand's crocs, similar to Vietnam's plan. While these animals are certainly still under major threat, it warms my heart to know that many people are attempting to save these amazing creatures. Now we're at one of my other favorite crocs, one of the more infamous animals, the mugger crocodile. Alongside Nile and saltwater crocodiles, this is the image in my head when I think of the quintessential crocodile. This species seems to have first appeared around 4 to 8 million years ago and quickly spread. Today, they can be found all across the Indian subcontinent, as far east as Bangladesh and as far west as Iran, as well as throughout a majority of India. Males of this species are mid-sized to large animals. Averages place them around 11.5 feet, about 3.5 meters long, but the largest animals far exceed this. The record for a mugger crocodile was 18.5 feet, around 5.6 meters long, and weighed in over 1,000 pounds. That being said, those sizes are of course incredibly rare, and most mugger crocs never attain nearly that size. It has a powerful set of jaws, the broadest of all living crocodiles. Muggers prefer shallow water compared to other crocodilians, and they only tend to enjoy fresh water. Thankfully, there are many freshwater systems across its territory. Muggers are rather voracious hunters, and they are not picky whatsoever. While adults do seem to favor fish more often, they will take whatever they can get when the opportunity arises. Aside from the usual prey, muggers will also hunt monkeys, otters, and even the local pythons. Their largest prey are usually chital or axis deer, but the larger animals are occasionally known to take on animals as big as water buffalo. This species is also somewhat intelligent. Like I mentioned previously, they are one of the only crocodilians known to use tools to any capacity. During birds' nesting seasons, crocodiles will find larger twigs and rest them on their head, just like alligators. They will wait just below the twigs under the water for birds to fly down and take them. This method of luring is actually impressively effective where they're from and shows real use of tools, as the crocs will consistently do this. Their intelligence extends further, as they have also been observed stashing their food, much like crows or ravens. Other crocs, like the Nile crocodile, also stash food as a way to make it softer and easier for them to eat, as they are not capable of chewing properly. Interestingly, like other crocs, they can also dig burrows in times of intense weather. This allows them to both survive the harsh heat and cold, as their burrows can maintain a consistent temperature. Muggers don't often have to compete for resources with other predators. They share territory with gharials, and while they may occasionally compete for fish, niche partitioning keeps competition between them to a relative minimum and allows them to coexist somewhat peacefully. The only real threats are big cats. Muggers share territory with two different big cats in two different areas. Its most common foe are tigers, specifically Bengal tigers. Tigers will occasionally steal kills from the crocs, and in desperate times they have even been seen hunting the smaller ones. These crocs also have to face some minor competition from lions. Most people aren't aware, but India has a small population of lions, the Asiatic or Persian lion as they are known. These lions have been known to do the same as tigers, fighting over food with larger crocs and hunting the smaller ones. However, these are still rare occurrences either way. Mugger crocodiles have been subject to tales and myths throughout the years. They are worshipped by several cultures, and sometimes differently. Some consider them a symbol of strength of the goddess of the Ganges, Ganga. Some believe them to represent a crocodile god known as Mogra Dev, whom they pray to for children and a blessed harvest. Others believe that they represent the strength of the river itself and its ability to both give and take away, destruction and creation. Because of their revered status, muggers were often placed in tanks in and around holy temples and sites for both Islamic and Hinduistic cultures. Much like Egypt, here they were treated like royalty and prayed to by the locals. Overall, muggers haven't faced as much threat from humans as other species, but almost suffered unintended consequences because of us anyways. In Pakistan, the waterways were drained in certain areas by the the arrival of dams. This, coupled with a massive drought that overtook the surrounding regions, drove these animals to their breaking point. It wasn't until hurricanes and other storms in the late 2000s reflooded these areas, which once again made them habitable for the mugger crocodiles. They have also faced other threats in the past, but few as severe as the dams. These threats prompted the governments of local countries to protect the croc starting in 1972. This has allowed them to make a recovery, but they are still facing some issues. They are often poached for parts, like alleged aphrodisiacs. Fishermen will sometimes kill them as they are seen as competition. Farmers will do the same if they see them as a threat to their livestock. However, this is worth noting that they are not usually local people who do this. In Iran and India, where locals still respect these animals, even in these conflicts, the crocodiles are never harmed. Rather, the local governments compensate the farmers for their lost cattle or goats, ensuring no retaliation to the crocodiles. I am unsure if this species has any breeding programs going on, but its populations have been slowly recovering naturally, and today there is thought to be over 9,000 individuals in the wild. Hopefully, with more focus and direction, this minor success can turn into something far more grand, and these animals can make a solid comeback. Finally, last but certainly not least, we come to the crocodile, what everyone imagines when they hear that word, the saltwater crocodile. These are the largest living reptiles on our planet. They are absolutely massive animals and have a wider range than most others. They can be found all across salt and freshwater environments from Australia to India and many places in between. Historically, it was thought that salties had a much wider range, possibly encompassing much of Asia's coastlines and brackish water systems. Today, however, they are most common in Australia and the Pacific Island nations and will still appear along coastal regions in places like India. This species is highly tolerant to saltwater, of course, and is far more commonly seen in the oceans than other species. Many salties have been known to travel extremely long distances. One particular individual was noted for having traveled 370 miles or 590 kilometers in the span of 25 days. They use the ocean currents to help themselves conserve energy, allowing it to carry them along. The oldest records of these animals date back to the Pliocene, around 5 million years ago for this species. Even since then, these animals have been huge, at least by today's standards. Historically, while a few other crocs can attain sizes of around 20 feet or 6 meters, none can do so as frequently as the saltwater crocodile. Depending on their location seems to change the average size of these animals, with richer environments creating larger animals. Using all the averages, they typically range from 12 feet, 3.6 meters, to 18 feet, about 5.5 meters. Remember, with crocs, the larger they get, they tend to bulk up after a certain point rather than grow lengthwise. Some places produce extremely small crocodiles, with some young adult males having been measured at only 7 feet or 2.1 meters long. Others, however, produce absolute beasts. As I said, many salties have been known to hit enormous sizes. One of the largest known crocs in captivity today, Cassius, is an 18-footer and weighs nearly 2,900 pounds, around 1,300 kilograms. Others in captivity have been even bigger. Lolong, one of the largest crocs ever held in captivity, was 20 feet 3 inches in length, around 6.2 meters. He was only the longest, however, and actually weighed less than Cassius does at 2,360 pounds, around 1,075 kilograms. It is worth noting that many other crocs have come around this size, but another thing too is that Cassius was last measured in 2011, so it is definitely possible that he's gotten significantly bigger over the last dozen or so years. I don't believe any specimen has ever been captured or measured at lengths or weights greater than these animals in any confirmed sense, but skulls tell another story. Crocodiles have been killed a lot historically, as I'm sure you can tell at this point, and these guys are no exception. Some of the skulls that we have of these animals show animals that could reach at least 23 feet or 7 meters in length, and with the bulk the skull shows, it was estimated that an animal that size would be around 3,300 pounds, about 1,500 kilograms. There have been numerous reports about even larger sizes, but many of these have been unconfirmed or disproven outright. There are claims about, quote, low Bolong's brother, unquote, and Chris the crocodile, but both of these animals are unconfirmed, and I believe Chris might even be downright disproven. This particular photo that so many people seem to associate with Chris the crocodile was taken back in the 1910s in an entirely different part of Australia. Chris was allegedly shot in 1957, but no remains of the animal or proof of that size was ever shown. Personally, I believe that it is a myth, though I don't doubt the giants have existed before. Chris was reported to be 28 feet or 8.5 meters long, significantly larger than what you would expect from a saltwater crocodile today. Multiple others have been proposed, but nothing has ever been confirmed, so as of now, 23 feet is the largest, but they can weigh a lot. While saltwater crocodiles still have strong armor, their armor is reduced in some places, allowing them more fluid movements. They are strongly built and wide animals, especially as they age. They have the strongest jaws of any living animal in terms of raw bite power. A 15-foot, 4.6-meter croc had a bite force of 3,700 pounds per square inch, and that was the highest ever recorded. Using this, it was estimated that the larger individuals could produce forces of up to 7,700 pounds per square inch. Absolutely devastating. All crocs may have a relatively strong bite force, though none living has one so strong as the salty. The way their jaws are structured, they have immense closing power, but not a lot of opening power. The same is true for a lot of crocodilians, which is why they can be restrained using duct tape or even just your bare hands if you're quick enough. Salties are some of the most active crocodilians, and despite that, they still spend a lot of their time doing nothing. They do this mainly to conserve energy and hunt when necessary or when an opportunity arises. They can go without eating for literal months. They are not picky at all, and they'll eat absolutely anything. Their prey just varies on opportunity, though they are able to track the migratory routes of some species and wait for them. They can take on most of the larger animals in their region, even water buffalo, with relative ease once they reach truly enormous sizes. Even at smaller sizes, they are capable of taking on surprisingly large prey like kangaroos, boar, and sea turtles. Like other crocodilians, they are surprisingly agile, with even giant crocodiles able to launch themselves out of the water with just their tail if the water is deep enough, allowing them to go straight upwards in pursuit of prey. They are unmatched by almost any predator in their range, with only animals like orcas and large sharks posing any real threat. In the case of the shark, it would likely not want to attack a crocodile. Crocodiles are known to sometimes kill and even eat large sharks, most commonly the bull shark, as they venture into the same brackish water territory. Salties are also one of the only native Australian animals that are able to eat the invasive cane toad, unlike their freshwater relatives. However, they can only do so in small amounts at a time, which unfortunately does not help much in the problem overall. Large crocs do not ignore small prey either, and will even target non-consequential meals if the opportunity is good enough. For these guys, anything is on the menu. Salties and humans have an extensive history together. Like other crocs, many have revered and feared these animals over the course of their history. The locals of Timor and the Papuans of New Guinea consider the animals sacred. In Australia, the indigenous Australian people believed that the saltwater crocodile was banished to saltwater because it was full of bad spirits and had grown too powerful and large. In contrast, it was believed by these same people that the freshwater crocodiles were holy and pure, which is why they were allowed to stay in the fresh water. Of course, saltwater crocodiles are still able to enter freshwater. They just have a higher tendency to spread out due to how territorial and aggressive they are. Males can occupy large stretches of water, and while they will tolerate others to some degree, smaller males must constantly be on their toes. While human attacks have certainly occurred over history, they are surprisingly low considering how much people fear this animal. This fear is likely due to efforts made by the local governments to warn people about the dangers of these animals and keeping human contact to a minimum to avoid potentially lethal confrontations for either party. There have been claims that saltwater crocodiles kill thousands of people yearly, but this has been proven false. From 1971 to 2013, over the course of 42 years, there were only 106 attacks recorded in Australia. Usually only 1 or 2 fatal attacks happen a year. If a croc does grab you, there is of course little chance of escape. Many crocs will do mock attacks or may lunge at people when they encroach on territory. While this has occasionally ended in injuries, many people walk away from such encounters because the crocs aren't after food, they just want you out of their home. In the past, this danger was turned into hatred, and many people shot and killed salties. Their skin, meat, eggs, and anything related were sold and taken in enormous quantities. So much killing occurred that in 1971 it was thought that they were almost completely extinct in Australia, with over 90% of the known Australian Australian population having been wiped out. Since then, of course, protections have been in place, but in many places they've not recovered. They are still often poached and murdered, resulting in extremely low numbers and a difficult recovery in many areas outside of Australia and even some areas within. Unfortunately, they continually lose territory to human developments, which groups like Wildlife Warriors, a group started by Steve Irwin and his family, are constantly combating. They, and others like them, are the main support of the crocs and have helped them at least somewhat recover. Thanks to efforts of groups like theirs, today these animals are not threatened with extinction, though they are missing from many of their ancestral homes. Hopefully in the future they can go back in peace and restore their rightful place as the king of the waterways. Crocodiles and pseudosuchians as a whole have had an insanely extensive history. There are so many gaps in our knowledge, but we can still put many of the pieces together about these amazing and ancient creatures. Though many of them are extinct, there are still amazing creatures today that we can study and learn, and so many fossils left behind that we can do the same. From land-based crocs to seafaring crocs to the crocs that we know and love today, this has been the dynasty of crocodiles. Folks, thank you all so very much for watching, and an extra big thank you to all my collaborators from both the previous and this video. This video and its predecessor took me quite some time to get together, so my apologies that it took me so very long. I am incredibly excited for future projects, and I thank you all for being very patient with me. As always, thank you all for watching once again. Remember to be good people, drink plenty of water, and I'll see you guys in the next one.